The creek whispered secrets beneath the autumn sun as the auctioneer's voice cracked like a whip across the assembled crowd. Next item, oak writing desk from the main house. Do I hear $15? In Silverwood Valley, folks said that men owned the land, but it was the land that owned women's souls. Standing at the edge of the gathering, Abigail Harrington wore her widow's black-like armor, the October wind pulling at her dark hair as she watched strangers bid on pieces of her life. The auctioneer, a stout man with sympathetic eyes that belied his businesslike tone, gestured toward the writing desk, where her mother had penned letters and her father had tallied the season's earnings, where Abigail herself had once drawn pictures of horses as a child, with dreams as wide as the Montana sky. Sold to Mr. Dawson for $18. Each fall of the auctioneer's gavel drove deeper into Abigail's heart. She had already lost her parents to consumption 5 years ago. Now, at 24, she had buried her husband and was watching her inheritance slip away piece by piece. Harrison Mills, president of Silverwood Bank, and her late husband's father pushed through the crowd toward the auctioneer's platform. His silver hair caught the sunlight, and his tailored suit marked him as a man of means, in a town where most folks measured wealth in cattle and acres rather than dollars and cents. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mills announced, commanding attention with the ease of a man accustomed to being heard, "we'll now proceed to the main event of today's proceedings." The crowd quieted. Even the distant lowing of cattle seemed to fade. Whispering Pines Ranch. 2,000 acres of prime grazing land, the main house and all outbuildings. He paused his gaze, finding Abigail in the crowd. Bidding starts at $3,000. Something broke inside her. "No!" The word escaped before she could contain it. Abigail stepped forward, aware of every eye turning toward her, the pitying glances of neighbors, the assessing looks of potential bidders. "That was my father's final promise," she said, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent yard. "That Whispering Pines would remain in the Harrington family. Always." Mills regarded her with the detached sympathy one might offer a child who didn't understand adult matters. "Mrs. Blackwood, I'm afraid your late husband's debts have left no alternative. The bank must recoup its losses." "Debts I never knew existed until after he died," Abigail replied, her voice steadier than her heart. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Several women exchanged glances, and Abigail caught the slight nod from Ruth Sullivan, an elderly black woman who stood apart from the others. The town's midwife and healer held Abigail's gaze with quiet dignity, offering strength when Abigail needed it most. Mills cleared his throat. "The law is clear on this matter. A wife inherits her husband's debts as surely as she does his name. And a bank president's son inherits his father's conscience." The words slipped out before Abigail could stop them, sharp as winter frost. A collective intake of breath swept through the onlookers. No one spoke to Harrison Mills that way, certainly not a woman, and never in public. For a moment, Mills's mask of civility slipped, revealing the cold calculation beneath. Then he smiled thinly. "The auction will proceed in 1 week's time, Mrs. Blackwood. I suggest you use that time to make arrangements for your future." The crowd began to disperse, conversations resuming in hushed tones. Abigail stood rooted, the weight of impending loss pressing down on her shoulders like the heavy wool of her mourning dress. A rough-hewn hand appeared at her elbow. Leonidas Carson, her ranch foreman, stood beside her, his weathered face a map of concern. "Miss Abigail," he said, his voice low, "let me take you back to the house." She nodded, allowing him to guide her toward the waiting wagon. As they passed the remnants of her life arranged on tables for strangers to claim, Abigail caught sight of Ruth Sullivan again. The old woman held something in her hands, a small cloth bundle tied with string, and nodded once more in Abigail's direction. A message, perhaps, or a promise. In Silverwood Valley, sometimes they were one and the same. The main house of Whispering Pines stood silent against the gathering dusk, its white clapboard walls tinged gold by the setting sun. From the porch, Abigail could see the eastern pasture where cattle grazed peacefully, unaware that their future hung as precariously as her own. 5 years ago, this view had belonged to her parents. Thomas and Elizabeth Harrington had built Whispering Pines from wilderness, naming it for the sound the wind made through the towering pines that bordered the creek. They had taught Abigail to ride, to read, to recognize the subtle signs in nature that foretold weather changes and seasons. Then consumption had taken them both within months of each other, leaving 19-year-old Abigail alone with 2,000 acres and responsibility that stretched beyond her experience. Declan Price, her father's lawyer, had arranged everything with cold efficiency in the parlor where she now stood. "Your father's will stipulates your betrothal to Oliver Blackwood," Price had said, adjusting his spectacles. "The marriage should take place within 6 months to secure the ranch's financial stability." Abigail remembered her parents differently than the practical arrangement Price described. Thomas Harrington would chase her mother around the kitchen stealing kisses, while Elizabeth laughed and swatted at him with her apron. They would dance without music on this very porch, whispering secrets that made them both blush like young lovers. Their marriage had been alive with affection. She had expected the same. Oliver Blackwood had arrived for their wedding in a black carriage that cost more than most ranch hands made in a year. The son of Silverwood's most prominent banker, he stood tall and handsome in his tailored suit, his golden hair slicked back with expensive pomade. The women of Silverwood Valley had whispered about Abigail's good fortune. "That girl struck gold, Mrs." Wilson, the pastor's wife, had remarked, fanning herself at the ceremony. "Oliver Blackwood could have had his pick of any girl from here to Denver." The wedding took place at Silverwood's First Methodist Church on a sweltering August afternoon in 1878. Abigail wore her mother's ivory dress altered to fit her smaller frame. During the ceremony, Oliver's hand had felt cold against hers. When Pastor Wilson pronounced them man and wife, Oliver's kiss was brief, more like sealing a business deal than beginning a life together. The trouble started that very night. "Remove that ridiculous dress," Oliver had commanded in their bedroom, his voice sharp with impatience. "And do something about your hair. It looks like you've been wrestling cattle." Abigail's fingers had trembled as she unpinned her wedding veil. I thought you might like it down. My father always said my mother looked beautiful with her hair loose." Oliver had laughed, but there was no warmth in it. "Your father was a simple rancher, Abigail. I'm not interested in some frontier woman pretending to be a lady. Try to conduct yourself with some dignity." The words had hit her like a physical blow. She had spent hours that morning arranging her dark hair the way her mother had taught her, weaving small wildflowers through the curls. "I was only trying to what? Impress me with your rustic charms." Oliver had loosened his collar, his movements sharp with irritation. "Save your efforts for something useful like learning to speak without that country drawl. It embarrasses me in public." Abigail's throat had tightened. Her parents had never criticized her voice. Her father had said she sounded like spring water over smooth stones. Her mother had encouraged her to sing while they worked together in the garden. The years that followed brought fresh humiliations daily. At breakfast, Oliver would grimace when she passed him the biscuits. "These taste like sawdust," he would announce, pushing the plate away. "Can't you manage something edible? Or shall I hire a cook to do what a proper wife should know?" When they attended church socials, He would correct her in front of others. Abigail means to say that beef prices have improved. He would interrupt, his tone condescending. Though I suppose ranch talk doesn't interest refined company. The women would smile tightly and change the subject, while Abigail's cheeks burned with shame. She began speaking less, then hardly at all in public. At the Silverwood harvest dance, Oliver refused to dance with her. "I won't make a spectacle of myself," he told her as she watched other couples waltz across the floor. "You move like you're herding sheep." Abigail had learned to dance from her father, who would hum melodies while they practiced on the front porch. She had dreamed of dancing with her husband, feeling graceful and cherished in his arms. Instead, she sat alone, while Oliver discussed banking business with the other men. The worst moments came when they were alone. Oliver would catalog her failures with the precision of a bookkeeper. "Your table manners are atrocious," he told her one evening after she had spent all day preparing his favorite meal. "You hold your fork like a field hand, and that dress makes you look like a milk cow. Do you own nothing that doesn't scream ranch girl?" Abigail looked down at the blue cotton dress her mother had sewn. She had chosen it because Oliver had once mentioned liking the color. Now it felt shabby against her skin. "I could have married Harriet Porter." Oliver continued cutting his steak with violent precision. "Her father owns the largest mercantile in Helena. She speaks French and plays piano. She knows how to conduct herself like a lady." "Then why didn't you—" The words slipped out before Abigail could stop them. Oliver's fork clattered against his plate. His eyes turned cold as January frost. "Because your ranch was part of the arrangement, my dear wife." His voice dripped with disdain. "Your father's land borders the railroad easement. When the Northern Pacific extends their line through Silverwood Valley, that easement will be worth $50,000. The truth hit harder than his cruelest insult. He had never wanted her. He wanted her inheritance, her land, her father's legacy. She was merely an inconvenience that came with the prize. Abigail stopped trying to please him after that. She stopped curling her hair, stopped attempting conversation at dinner, stopped wearing her mother's jewelry. She moved through their shared house like a ghost, speaking only when spoken to, eating in silence, while he listed her deficiencies. The fire came on a February night, when the wind howled down from the mountains. Abigail had been in the kitchen reading her mother's old recipe book by lamplight when she smelled smoke. She ran outside to see flames consuming the barn where they stored winter feed. "Oliver!" she screamed toward the house. "The barn's on fire!" But Oliver was already running toward the flames, shouting about important papers he had stored in the barn's office. Abigail watched in horror as he disappeared into the burning structure. She ran to the bunkhouse, rousing the ranch hands. But by the time they organized a bucket brigade, the barn was fully engulfed. They could hear Oliver calling for help from inside, but the flames were too intense. When the roof collapsed, his cries went silent. They found his body the next morning clutched around a metal strongbox that contained banking documents. The papers inside were nothing but ash. Standing beside his grave at Silverwood Cemetery, Abigail felt something die inside her, something that had nothing to do with grief. She had tried so hard to be the wife Oliver wanted, and he had repaid her with cruelty and contempt. "I'll never marry again," she whispered to the wind as dirt fell onto his coffin. "Never again will I let a man's words cut me down to nothing." Now, 5 months after Oliver's death, Abigail stared at the ledger books spread across her father's old desk pulled from storage after the auction. The numbers refused to align, much like the pieces of her shattered life. A soft knock at the study door interrupted her thoughts. Leonidas Carson stood in the doorway, hat in hand, his dark face solemn in the lamplight. Found these in the old barn foundation, Miss Abigail. He placed a metal box on the desk. The corners were warped from heat, but the lock remained intact. Thought you might want to see what's inside. Abigail ran her fingers over the scorched metal. This is what Oliver died trying to save. Leonidas nodded. Appears so. Do you have any idea what's in it? No, ma'am, but whatever it is, Mr. Blackwood thought it worth his life. After Leonidas departed, Abigail sat staring at the box. With a letter opener from her desk, she pried at the damaged lock until it gave way with a reluctant snap. Inside lay documents, banknotes, property deeds, and letters. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the first paper, a deed of transfer for Whispering Pines to the Northern Pacific Railroad Company, already signed with Oliver's name, requiring only her signature to be complete. The date on the document was 3 weeks before the fire. More papers revealed a web of loans taken against the ranch loans she had never known about, much less approved. Oliver had systematically mortgaged every acre of Whispering Pines to finance investments in mining ventures and railroad stock. A letter from Harrison Mills to his son confirmed her worst suspicions. Once the deal with Northern Pacific is complete, your debts will be cleared, and you'll have sufficient capital to establish yourself properly in Helena, away from that backwater and the ranch girl who has served her purpose. Abigail's hands shook as she read the final lines. Ensure your wife signs the transfer. Her signature is all that stands between you and freedom from that marriage of convenience. The letter was dated February 10, 1883, 2 days before the fire. Oliver hadn't died trying to save important bank records. He had died trying to hide evidence of his betrayal. As the full weight of the deception settled over her, something hardened in Abigail's heart. The bank would take her land in 1 week, unless she could raise $3,000 money she didn't have and couldn't borrow. Silverwood Valley had taken her parents, her innocence, and soon her inheritance. But it would not take her dignity. Not again. The church stood silent in the moonlight as Abigail pushed open the heavy wooden door. At this hour, the sanctuary was empty, the pews casting long shadows across the floor. She moved down the center aisle, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. She hadn't come to pray. Not exactly. But she needed somewhere to think, somewhere that held memories of her parents' faith, rather than Oliver's betrayal. The Harrington family Bible lay on the altar where it had been placed after her parents' funeral. Pastor Wilson had suggested it remain in the church, since you'll be joining the Blackwood family name. At the time, she had been too grief-stricken to argue. Now, Abigail lifted the heavy book, its leather binding worn smooth by generations of hands. Opening it, she found the family record: births, marriages, deaths recorded in her father's steady hand, then her mother's more flowing script, and finally, her own tentative addition of her parents' death dates. As she turned the pages, an envelope slipped free, yellowed with age. Her mother's handwriting addressed it simply, "For my daughter, when she needs guidance." With trembling fingers, Abigail broke the seal and unfolded the paper inside. "My dearest Abigail, if you're reading this, then I am no longer beside you to offer counsel. I pray it is because you have grown into a woman with daughters of your own. But I fear illness may take me sooner. Your father's cough worsens daily. Remember this, my darling girl. The strength of a woman lies not in what she owns, but in what she believes. Your father built Whispering Pines with his hands, but I built it with my heart. The land is valuable, yes, but not as valuable as your spirit. In times of darkness, remember the old spring on the North Ridge. The water there runs clear even in the harshest drought. I used to go there when difficulties seemed overwhelming. Something about that place renews the spirit as surely as it renews the body. Whatever trials you face, face them with courage. Whatever losses you endure, remember that what truly matters cannot be taken from you. With endless love, Mother, tucked inside the letter was a small hand-drawn map of Whispering Pines, with an X marking a location on the North Ridge, and the words Life Water written in her mother's script. Abigail clutched the letter to her chest, tears flowing freely for the first time since Oliver's death. Not tears for him, but for the parents who had loved her truly, and for the girl she had been before marriage hardened her heart. A sound at the church door made her turn. Ruth Sullivan stood in the entrance, her silhouette framed by moonlight. "Thought I might find you here, child," the old woman said, her voice gentle as she approached the altar. "Trouble has a way of driving us to sacred places." Abigail hastily wiped her tears. "Mrs. Sullivan, I didn't expect anyone to be about at this hour." "Old bones don't need much sleep." Ruth settled beside her in the front pew. "And I promised your mother I'd keep an eye on you." "You knew my mother well." Ruth nodded. Elizabeth Harrington was one of the few in Silverwood who saw people for who they were, not what they appeared to be. She glanced at the letter in Abigail's hands. "I see you found her message. You knew about this. I helped her hide it. When consumption took hold, she worried what might happen to you and the ranch. Thomas was already too sick to protect either." Abigail refolded the letter carefully. "It doesn't matter now. The bank takes everything in a week." "Perhaps," Ruth said. "Or perhaps not." From her shawl she produced the small bundle Abigail had seen her holding at the auction. "This belongs to you." Unwrapping the cloth, Abigail found a silver pendant on a leather cord, a small pine tree etched into the metal. "It was your mother's," Ruth explained. "She wanted you to have it when the time was right. And now is that time. You stand at a crossroads, child. The path ahead looks dark, but there are lights to guide you that you cannot yet see." Ruth took Abigail's hand, placing the pendant in her palm and closing her fingers around it. "Wear this, and remember who you are, not who that man tried to make you." As Ruth's weathered hands enveloped hers, Abigail felt a curious warmth spreading from the pendant through her fingers. For a moment, the church seemed to fade away, replaced by the scent of pine and the sound of running water. "The spring on the North Ridge," Abigail whispered. "My mother wrote about it." Ruth nodded. "The life water. The old ones knew its power long before your family came to this valley. In the harshest drought, it never fails. But how does a spring help me save the ranch?" "Not all treasures gleam like gold, child." Ruth rose slowly. "Come see me tomorrow. There's more you should know." As the old woman moved toward the door, Abigail called after her, "Mrs. Sullivan, thank you." Ruth paused, silhouetted once more against the moonlight. "Your mother was my friend when others in this town crossed the street rather than walk beside me. Now I honor that friendship by helping her daughter." She disappeared into the night, leaving Abigail alone with her mother's letter, the silver pendant, and the first stirrings of hope she had felt in months. Dawn broke over Whispering Pines with golden fingers of light stretching across the eastern pasture. Abigail stood on the porch, her mother's pendant cool against her skin beneath her dress. She had slept little, her mind churning with the contents of Oliver's strongbox and her mother's letter. The ranch was already stirring to life. From the corral came the sound of horses nickering for their morning feed. The smell of coffee drifted from the bunkhouse where the ranch hands prepared for the day's work. With new purpose, Abigail crossed the yard toward the stables. If she had only a week left at Whispering Pines, She would spend it reconnecting with the land she loved, beginning with a ride to the North Ridge and the spring her mother had marked on the map. The stable's interior was cool and fragrant with hay. Morning light filtered through high windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in golden beams. A man she didn't immediately recognize stood brushing down her father's old gelding, Samson. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and kept his head slightly bowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. His movements were methodical and gentle as he ran the brush along the horse's flank. "Good morning," Abigail said, startled to find a stranger in her stable. The man turned, touching the brim of his hat, in acknowledgement, but keeping his face angled away. "Ma'am?" His voice was low, resonant. "Sorry if I disturbed you. Leonidas asked me to ready the horses." "You're new," Abigail observed. "I don't believe we've met." "Nathaniel Sullivan. Been working the north pasture mostly. Started after—" He paused. "After your husband passed." "Sullivan, are you related to Mrs. Ruth Sullivan?" "My grandmother." He continued brushing the horse, his movements never faltering. Abigail stepped closer, curious about this man who seemed determined to avoid her gaze. "I'm riding to the North Ridge this morning. Would you saddle my mare, please? The North Ridge has rough terrain, ma'am. Better take Samson. He's sure-footed on those slopes." "I've ridden that ridge since childhood, Mr. Sullivan. I know its terrain." Nathaniel finally looked up, and Abigail barely concealed her shock. The right side of his face bore a network of scars. Burn scars, she realized, that pulled at the corner of his mouth and extended down his neck, disappearing beneath his collar. His right eye, though intact, was surrounded by rippled, discolored skin. If he noticed her reaction, he gave no sign. "Of course, ma'am. I'll saddle your mare." As he moved to the adjacent stall, Abigail gathered her composure. "How long have you worked with horses, Mr. Sullivan?" "All my life, one way or another." His hands moved with practiced efficiency as he lifted the saddle. "Animals don't care what a man looks like. They care how he treats them." The simple wisdom of the statement caught her off guard. "No, I suppose they don't." When he led her mare into the yard, Abigail noticed that his right hand also bore burn scars, yet his movements remained fluid, competent. He offered his left hand to help her mount, and she took it without hesitation. "Thank you, Mr. Sullivan." "Ma'am?" He stepped back once more, touching the brim of his hat. "Ride careful. Storms brewing to the west." Abigail glanced at the clear blue sky, perplexed. "There's not a cloud in sight." "Not all storms show themselves before they arrive." With that cryptic statement, he turned and led Samson back into the stable. As she rode away from the ranch house, Abigail found herself pondering the scarred man with the gentle hands. There was something in his manner, a quiet dignity, that reminded her of her father. Thomas Harrington had always said you could judge a man by how he treated those who could do nothing for him, animals, children, and the elderly. By that measure, Nathaniel Sullivan might be worth knowing better. The North Ridge rose above whispering pines, like a sentinel, its slopes covered with the pine trees that gave the ranch its name. Abigail followed the map, guiding her mare along a narrow trail that wound upward through stands of timber. The air grew cooler as she ascended, carrying the scent of pine resin and wild sage. Birds called from the canopy overhead, and once a deer and fawn bounded across the path ahead, startling her mare into a momentary sidestep. "Easy, Belle," she murmured, patting the horse's neck. "Just some neighbors saying hello." Near the summit, the trail opened into a small clearing. According to her mother's map, the spring lay just beyond. Abigail dismounted, tethering Belle to a young pine, and continued on foot. The clearing ended abruptly at a rocky outcropping. Water bubbled from a crevice in the stone, forming a small pool, before continuing downhill as a slender stream. Around the pool grew plants she didn't recognize, herbs with tiny purple flowers, and leaves that released a sharp, clean scent when she brushed them with her fingers. This was the place her mother had marked as life water. Kneeling beside the pool, Abigail cupped her hands and drank. The water was startlingly cold and sweet, carrying a mineral taste that reminded her of the air after lightning. As she lowered her hands for a second drink, a reflection appeared in the water beside her own, a man's face, weathered and solemn. Abigail spun around, nearly losing her balance. Jesse Thornton, the ranch manager who had worked for her father and stayed on after her marriage, stood at the edge of the clearing. His face, normally impassive, showed concern. "Miss Abigail," he said, removing his hat. "Didn't mean to startle you. Leonidas said you'd ridden out alone. Thought I should make sure you're all right." "I'm perfectly fine, Mr. Thornton." She rose, brushing dirt from her skirt. "Just visiting a place my mother used to come." Jesse nodded, his eyes moving to the spring. "Your mother was a wise woman. She understood the value of this place." "You knew about the spring." "Your father showed me when I first came to work at Whispering Pines. Said it never runs dry, even in the worst drought." He gestured to the surrounding trees. "Notice how the pines here grow taller, greener than the rest. This water nurtures everything it touches." Abigail glanced around with new awareness. The vegetation near the spring did indeed seem more vibrant, as if the very air held more life. "Mr. Thornton," she said, deciding to trust the man who had served her family faithfully for years. "What do you know about my husband's death?" Jesse's weathered face tightened. "What makes you ask that, Miss Abigail?" "I found his strong box, the one he died trying to retrieve from the fire." She watched his expression carefully. There were documents inside. "Plans to sell the ranch to the railroad without my knowledge." Jesse sighed heavily, settling his hat back on his graying head. "I feared as much." "You knew, suspected. The night of the fire I saw Mr. Blackwood riding back from town late. He seemed agitated. Went straight to the barn instead of the house." "What was he doing there?" "Can't say for certain, but about an hour later I smelled smoke." Jesse met her gaze directly. "Miss Abigail, there's something you should know. Your husband didn't die trying to save those documents." Abigail felt her heart constrict. "What do you mean, he died trying to destroy them? When we found him—" Jesse paused, choosing his words carefully. "He wasn't clutching that box to save it from the fire. He was holding it in the flames. The barn fire wasn't an accident. He started it." The revelation struck her like a physical blow. "Are you saying Oliver committed suicide?" "No, ma'am. I'm saying he was trying to destroy evidence. Something must have gone wrong with his plan. Maybe the fire spread faster than he expected. But his intent was clear. Evidence of what the railroad sale—" Jesse shifted uncomfortably. "That and more. There were rumors in town about money missing from the bank, depositors' funds invested in risky ventures." He shook his head. Nothing proven, but talk was starting to spread. Abigail remembered the investments mentioned in Oliver's papers, mining ventures that had failed, railroad stocks that had plummeted in value. "He was embezzling," she whispered, the pieces falling into place, "using bank funds for his own investments. And when they failed—" "He planned to sell your ranch to cover his losses," Jesse finished. "But something spooked him. My guess is his father found out what he'd done. And now Harrison Mills is foreclosing on Whispering Pines to recover the bank's losses. Losses his own son created." The bitter irony burned in her throat. using my inheritance to clean up his family's mess. I'm sorry, Miss Abigail. Your father would never have approved that marriage had he known what kind of man Oliver Blackwood truly was. A sudden breeze stirred the pines, sending a shower of needles onto the surface of the pool. Abigail watched the ripples spread, distorting her reflection. Mr. Thornton, is there any way to stop the bank from taking the ranch only by paying what's owed, $3,000 by next Saturday? And if I can't, Jesse's eyes held genuine regret. Then, Whispering Pines goes to auction, and Harrison Mills makes sure it sells for exactly what the bank is owed, probably to a buyer of his choosing. Abigail touched the silver pendant beneath her dress. Her mother had brought her to this spring for a reason. The water that never failed, even in drought. Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Thornton. She gathered Belle's reins. We should return to the ranch. There's work to be done. As they rode down the ridge, the first clouds appeared on the western horizon, dark and heavy with promise. Nathaniel Sullivan's prediction of a storm no longer seemed so mysterious. Some storms gave warning after all. The question was whether you heeded them in time. Ruth Sullivan's cabin stood at the edge of Silverwood, where the town gave way to wilderness. Unlike the neat white houses closer to the church and bank, Ruth's home seemed to grow from the earth itself. Weathered logs, chinked with clay, a roof of wooden shingles covered in part with climbing vines, a garden that blurred the boundary between cultivation and nature. Abigail knocked on the rough-hewn door, still processing Jesse Thornton's revelations about Oliver and the fire. The door swung open to reveal Ruth, her silver hair braided and wrapped around her head like a crown. "Right on time," the old woman said, as if she had been expecting Abigail at this precise moment. "Come in before the rain starts." The interior of the cabin was warm and fragrant, with herbs hanging from the rafters, some familiar, others strange to Abigail. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, despite the mild day, and near it sat a large black cat that regarded Abigail with unblinking golden eyes. "That's Midnight," Ruth said, noticing Abigail's glance. "Don't mind him. He judges everyone that way." "He's beautiful," Abigail replied, though beautiful seemed an inadequate word for the animal's regal bearing. Ruth gestured to a chair at a small table already set with cups and a steaming teapot. "Sit. We have much to discuss, and the storm won't wait." As if summoned by her words, thunder rumbled in the distance. "Your grandson said a storm was coming," Abigail said as she settled into the chair. "I didn't believe him this morning, but it seems he was right." Nathaniel sees many things others miss. Ruth poured tea into Abigail's cup, a rich amber liquid that smelled of herbs and honey. "Did you find the spring?" "Yes, and I learned more than I expected about my husband's death." Ruth nodded, unsurprised. "Jesse Thornton finally told you the truth, then?" "You knew. I know the patterns of men's hearts, child. Oliver Blackwood carried darkness in his visible to those who know how to look." She sipped her own tea. "The fire that took him was of his own making in more ways than one." Abigail wrapped her hands around the warm cup. "Mrs. Sullivan, why did you want me to find that spring? My mother's letter said it never fails, even in drought. But how does that help me? Now I need $3,000 in a week, not water." "Sometimes what we think we need isn't what we truly need," Ruth said. "That spring has flowed since before my grandmother's time, when the Blackfoot people still hunted these lands freely. They called it medicine water because it healed both body and spirit." "It's just water," Abigail protested gently. Ruth's dark eyes held ancient wisdom. "Is it the plants around that spring grow when others wither? Animals journey miles to drink from it during drought. And your mother found her strength there, when life's burdens grew too heavy. Lightning flashed, followed by a crack of thunder that seemed to shake the cabin's walls. Rain began to patter against the roof. "The storm has arrived," Ruth murmured. "Just as a storm comes to your life, Abigail Harrington." "Blackwood," Abigail corrected automatically. "No," Ruth's voice was firm. "You are a Harrington. That name was your birthright, and no marriage certificate or gravestone changes who you truly are." The words struck a chord deep within Abigail. How quickly she had surrendered her identity to a man who had never valued it. "What should I do?" she asked, surprising herself with the question. "How do I fight the bank Harrison Mills?" "Not alone," Ruth replied. "No one fights alone and wins." She reached across the table and took Abigail's hand. "You'll need allies, people who see your worth beyond your land or your name." "I have few friends in Silverwood." Oliver made sure of that. "Then look where you haven't looked before." Ruth released her hand and rose, moving to a cedar chest in the corner. From it, she withdrew a small book bound in faded leather. "This was your mother's. She left it with me for safekeeping." Abigail accepted the book with reverent hands. Opening it, she found page after page filled with her mother's handwriting recipes for medicines, notes on weather patterns, observations about crops and livestock. "Her garden journal," Abigail whispered. "I remember her writing in this every evening." More than a garden journal, a record of wisdom. Ruth tapped the open page. Elizabeth knew the land in ways few others did. She understood its patterns, its needs, its gifts. That knowledge is your inheritance, as surely as the deed to Whispering Pines. Thunder crashed directly overhead, and the cabin's door burst open. Nathaniel Sullivan stood in the doorway, rain streaming from his hat and coat, his scarred face stark in a flash of lightning. "Grandma," he said, his deep voice tense. "They're coming." "Who?" Abigail asked, rising from her chair. Ruth's expression grew grave. "Pastor Wilson and his deacons, I expect." She turned to Abigail. "They've been looking for a reason to drive me from Silverwood for years. Seems they've finally found one." "What reason?" "They call it witchcraft," Ruth said, her tone matter-of-fact. "I call it healing. The names change, but fear remains the same." Nathaniel moved further into the cabin, water pooling at his feet. "Mrs. Blackwood shouldn't be here when they arrive." "No," Ruth agreed. "Take her back to Whispering Pines. Use the forest path." "I'm not leaving you to face them alone," Abigail protested. Ruth's smile was gentle but determined. "Child, I've faced their kind for 75 years. A few more men with crosses and righteous anger won't trouble me." She pressed Abigail's mother's journal into her hands. "Take this. Study it. The answers you seek are within its pages." Another crash of thunder punctuated her words, followed by the distant sound of men's voices. "Go," Ruth urged. "Nathaniel knows the way." Before Abigail could argue further, Nathaniel took her elbow, guiding her toward a back door she hadn't noticed before. As they slipped out into the rain, she caught a final glimpse of Ruth Sullivan standing in the center of her cabin, straight-backed and dignified, the black cat at her feet, and the fire casting her shadow large against the wall. The old woman raised her hand in a gesture that might have been blessing or farewell. Then Nathaniel pulled Abigail into the storm, and the door closed behind them. The rain fell in sheets as Nathaniel led Abigail through the forest, his hand firm on her arm to steady her on the slippery path. They had left Ruth's cabin just as torches appeared through the trees, a procession of men led by Pastor Wilson, their faces set in grim determination. "What will they do to her?" Abigail gasped, struggling to keep pace with Nathaniel's long strides. "Nothing they haven't tried before," he replied, his voice barely audible above the storm. "Grandma knows how to handle men like Wilson." They emerged from the trees at the edge of Whispering Pines' north pasture. Nathaniel whistled a piercing sound that carried despite the rain, and moments later 2 horses appeared, Abigail's mare and a sturdy bay gelding. "You planned this?" Abigail realized as Nathaniel helped her mount. "Grandma sees trouble coming before it arrives." He swung onto his own horse with surprising grace for such a large man. "Just like she saw you coming to her today." They rode hard through the downpour, taking a route that skirted Silverwood town. By the time they reached the Whispering Pines ranch house, Abigail's clothes were soaked through and her teeth chattered with cold. Leonidas met them at the door, concern etched on his weathered face. "Miss Abigail, we've been worried sick. Jesse said you'd gone to visit Mrs. Sullivan, then the storm hit." "I'm fine, Leonidas," she assured him, though she felt far from fine. "But Mrs. Sullivan may not be. Pastor Wilson and some men from town were heading to her cabin when we left." Leonidas exchanged a look with Nathaniel. "The pastor's been working folks up about Ruth for weeks. Claims she's practicing heathen rituals, corrupting the town's women with her remedies." "That's absurd," Abigail said, handing her dripping cloak to the housekeeper who had appeared with towels. "Mrs. Sullivan has delivered half the babies in this valley and treated everything from fevers to broken bones." "How is that heathen?" "Fear makes men see devils where there are only differences," Nathaniel said quietly, declining the offered towel. Water ran from his hat brim, obscuring his scarred face in shadow. "I should get back to her." "Not in this storm," Leonidas objected. "You'd do her no good, drowned in Silverwood Creek." "He's right," Abigail added. "Wait until the rain eases. Besides, your grandmother seemed prepared for their visit." Nathaniel's mouth tightened, but he nodded. "First light, then." As he turned to leave, Abigail called after him. "Mr. Sullivan, thank you for your help today." He paused at the door, his profile outlined against the gray light from outside. For a moment, it seemed he might say more, but then he simply touched the brim of his hat and disappeared into the rain. Leonidas watched him go, then turned to Abigail. "That man has stories he doesn't tell." "Don't we all?" Abigail replied, thinking of the secrets she had uncovered in the past 2 days. Oliver's betrayal the spring on the North Ridge, her mother's hidden journal. Some are just written more visibly than others. Later, dry and warm in her father's study, Abigail opened her mother's journal. By lamplight, she pored over pages of careful observations, medicinal recipes, and notes about Whispering Pines' natural cycles. One entry in particular caught her attention, March 18, 1870. The North Ridge spring flows stronger after the thaw. Discovered unusual sediment in the pool, glittering specks that cling to wet fingers. Thomas believes it may be mineral deposits, perhaps even traces of silver. He forbids further investigation, saying we promised the Blackfoot elders we would leave the sacred site undisturbed. I understand his commitment to honor that pledge, but I wonder if someday this knowledge might serve Abigail when we are gone. Silver. The word leapt from the page like a revelation. Traces of silver in the spring that never failed, even in drought. Her mother had left more than memories and a silver pendant. She had left a map to salvation if Abigail was brave enough to follow where it led. Outside, the storm raged on washing Silverwood Valley clean. By morning, perhaps it would wash away her doubts as well. For the first time since Oliver's death since her marriage, really, Abigail felt a spark of true hope. Not hope based on a man's promises or a bank's mercy, but hope rooted in her own strength and her mother's foresight. If there was silver on Whispering Pines land, Perhaps she could save her inheritance after all. And if saving it meant defying not only Harrison Mills and the bank, but also her father's promise to the Blackfoot elders, well, that was a moral reckoning for tomorrow. Tonight she would plan. Tomorrow she would act. The land that had shaped her would not be taken without a fight. Morning arrived at Whispering Pines with the clean, washed scent that follows a night of heavy rain. Puddles dotted the yard, reflecting the pale blue sky, where only scattered clouds remained of the previous night's storm. From her bedroom window, Abigail watched as the ranch hands moved about their morning chores, feeding livestock, repairing a section of fence damaged by the wind leading horses from the stable to the corral. She had slept little, her mind racing with the discovery in her mother's journal. Silver on Whispering Pines land could change everything if she could find it, if there was enough to matter, if she could extract it before the bank foreclosed in 6 days. Too many ifs to count on. After dressing in her plainest work clothes, a faded blue skirt and sturdy cotton blouse, Abigail descended to the kitchen where Mrs. Finch, the housekeeper, was preparing breakfast. "You're up early, Miss Abigail," the older woman observed, sliding a plate of eggs and biscuits onto the table. "And dressed for riding, I see." "I have matters to attend to on the North Ridge," Abigail replied, accepting the cup of coffee Mrs. Finch poured. "Has Mr. Sullivan returned to town yet?" "Left at first light, just as he said he would." Mrs. Finch's expression tightened with disapproval. "Didn't even take breakfast. That boy never thinks of himself." "Boy? He must be 30 at least. 32, I believe. Still a boy to these old eyes." Mrs. Finch placed a jar of preserves on the table with unnecessary force. "His grandmother raised him right, despite what folks in town might say." Abigail spread blackberry preserves on a biscuit, considering this. "What do folks say about the Sullivans, Mrs. Finch?" The housekeeper glanced toward the door, as if checking for eavesdroppers, then lowered her voice. "They say Ruth Sullivan practices heathen ways, that she speaks to spirits and reads fortunes in tea leaves." She shook her head. "Nonsense, of course. Ruth delivers babies and mends broken bones when the nearest real doctor is 2 days' ride away. If that's witchcraft, we need more witches in Silverwood Valley." "And her grandson, what do they say of him?" "That he's cursed on account of his scars." Mrs. Finch's voice softened. "Poor man got those saving people from a fire, but folks see what they want to see." "What fire?" Abigail asked, her interest piqued. Before Mrs. Finch could answer, Jessie Thornton appeared in the doorway, hat in hand. "Morning, Miss Abigail. Sorry to interrupt your breakfast, but there's trouble in town. Thought you should know." Abigail set down her coffee cup. "What kind of trouble?" "Pastor Wilson had Ruth Sullivan arrested last night. They're holding her in the jail, talking about a trial for witchcraft." "Witchcraft? This isn't Salem in 1692. They can't seriously—" "They are," Jessie interrupted grimly. "Pastor's got folks worked up. Says Ruth caused the drought with her ungodly practices, then brought the storm to destroy crops just when they were recovering." "That's absurd." Abigail pushed back from the table, her breakfast forgotten. "Where is Nathaniel now?" "At the jail, I expect. He rode out like the devil himself was after him when word reached the bunkhouse." Abigail reached for her shawl. "Have my horse saddled, Mr. Thornton. I'm going to town." "Miss Abigail," Jessie cautioned, "this isn't your fight. Ruth Sullivan was my mother's friend when few in Silverwood would claim that title." She fastened her shawl with determined fingers. "Besides, I owe her and her grandson for their help yesterday." As Jessie left to saddle her horse, Mrs. Finch touched Abigail's arm. "Be careful, miss. Pastor Wilson has powerful friends, including your father-in-law." Harrison Mills stopped having any claim on my loyalty the moment he decided to take my ranch for his son's debts. Abigail straightened her shoulders. It's time Silverwood remembered there's more than one way to measure a person's worth. Silverwood's main street glistened with mud after the night's rain. Wagons and riders had already carved deep ruts through the mire, forcing Abigail to guide her mare carefully as she approached the small jailhouse at the town's center. A crowd had gathered outside, men in Sunday suits, despite it being Wednesday, women in their best dresses, children peering curiously between adults' legs. At the jailhouse steps stood Pastor Wilson, his tall frame draped in black Bible clutched in one hand as he addressed the assembled townsfolk. "The Lord sends drought to test our faith," he intoned, his voice carrying across the murmuring crowd. "And when we turn to ungodly remedies, he sends storms to remind us of his power." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the onlookers. "Ruth Sullivan has long practiced arts forbidden by Scripture," Wilson continued, "mixing potions, reading signs, luring good Christian women away from proper medicine with her heathen remedies." From her position at the edge of the crowd, Abigail could see Nathaniel Sullivan standing near the jailhouse door, his tall frame rigid with tension, his scarred face exposed to the morning sun without his customary hat to shield it. Two men deacons from the church she recognized blocked his path to the door. Dismounting, Abigail tied her mare to a hitching post and made her way through the crowd. Whispers followed her progress. "That's Oliver Blackwood's widow. Heard she visited the witch yesterday. Banking trouble at Whispering Pines?" She ignored them, moving steadily forward until she reached the front of the gathering. Pastor Wilson paused mid-sentence, his rheumy eyes narrowing at her intrusion. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, his tone carefully modulated between welcome and warning. "We're conducting important town business here. Perhaps you should—" "I'd like to see Mrs. Sullivan." Abigail interrupted, her voice carrying clearly across the now hushed crowd. Wilson's face tightened. "I'm afraid that's not possible. The prisoner is not receiving visitors." "Prisoner, on what charge has she been arrested?" "Practicing witchcraft, disturbing the peace, and," he consulted a paper in his Bible, "inciting discord among the womenfolk of Silverwood." Abigail raised her eyebrows. "Inciting discord by delivering their babies and treating their ailments when no doctor would come, by filling their heads with pagan nonsense," Wilson retorted, "by undermining the natural order established by God himself." "And what natural order might that be, Pastor?" Abigail took a step closer, aware of every eye upon her. "The order where women suffer in silence, where knowledge of healing plants is called witchcraft, if it comes from a woman of color, but medicine, if it comes from a man with a certificate." A murmur rippled through the crowd, some supportive, others disapproving. From the corner of her eye, Abigail saw Nathaniel watching her intently, something like surprise flickering across his scarred features. "Mrs. Blackwood," Wilson said, his voice hardening, "you're speaking of matters you don't understand. I understand that Ruth Sullivan nursed my mother through her final illness when everyone else feared consumption might be catching. I understand that she's delivered half the children in this valley and saved countless lives with her knowledge of healing herbs." Abigail swept her gaze across the assembled townspeople. "How many of you have sought her help when fever struck your family, when a birth went wrong, when traditional medicine failed?" Several women shifted uncomfortably. One, Mrs. Cooper, the blacksmith's wife, even raised her hand slightly before her husband nudged it down. "That doesn't change the fact that she practices ungodly arts," Wilson insisted, though with less certainty than before. "Show me where in your Bible it says healing the sick is ungodly." Abigail turned to address the crowd directly. Ruth Sullivan deserves our gratitude, not our condemnation, and certainly not imprisonment on charges straight from the Dark Ages. That's enough. The sharp voice came not from Pastor Wilson, but from behind him. Harrison Mills emerged from the jailhouse, his silver hair immaculate, his suit unsullied despite the muddy street. Behind him came Sheriff Taylor, looking decidedly uncomfortable with the entire situation. "Mrs. Blackwood," Mills said, injecting her married name with subtle disdain, "you're causing a public disturbance. I suggest you return to Whispering Pines before you further damage what remains of your reputation." "My reputation?" Abigail let out a small, incredulous laugh. "That's rich, coming from the man whose son embezzled from his own bank, then tried to cover his crimes by burning down my barn with himself inside it." A shocked silence fell over the crowd. Even Pastor Wilson seemed momentarily speechless. "How dare you?" Mills finally sputtered, his face reddening. "My son died a hero, trying to save important documents from the fire." "Your son died a thief and a liar," Abigail retorted, past caring about propriety. "And you know it. That's why you're so eager to foreclose on Whispering Pines. It's not about recovering the bank's money. It's about covering up Oliver's crimes before anyone else discovers them." Mills took a menacing step toward her. "You've lost your mind, woman. Sheriff, I want her arrested for slander." Before Sheriff Taylor could respond, Nathaniel Sullivan moved between Abigail and Mills, his large frame a sudden barrier. "You'll not touch her," he said, his voice low but carrying across the now silent street. Mills recoiled slightly at the sight of Nathaniel's scarred face so close to his own. "Get out of my way, Sullivan. This doesn't concern you. It concerns my grandmother unjustly held in that jail. It concerns Mrs. Blackwood, whom you're threatening. That makes it my concern." Nathaniel's tone remained level, but there was steel beneath the calm. "Sheriff, I believe Mrs. Blackwood has raised serious questions about Mr. Mills' motives. Perhaps an investigation into the bank's records is in order before any further arrests are made." Sheriff Taylor, a thin man with a perpetually worried expression, looked from Mills to Nathaniel to Abigail, clearly wishing he were anywhere else. "Now, folks, let's all just calm down. No need for arrests or investigations. I'm sure we can sort this out civilly." "There's nothing to sort out," Mills snapped. "This woman is distraught, making wild accusations because she's about to lose her ranch. And Sullivan here is trying to deflect attention from his grandmother's crimes." "I have proof," Abigail said, her voice cutting through the tension. "Oliver's strongbox recovered from the barn fire. It contains documents showing he mortgaged Whispering Pines without my knowledge to cover investment losses, investments made with bank funds." The crowd's murmuring grew louder. Several men, local merchants who likely had deposits at Mills's bank, pressed closer, their expressions shifting from curiosity to concern. Mills forced a laugh. "Preposterous. Even if such documents existed, they were destroyed in the fire." "The strongbox survived," Abigail countered. "And so did the papers inside it. I'd be happy to share them with Sheriff Taylor and with any depositor who's concerned about the safety of their money." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Mills's composed features. "This is absurd. Sheriff, control your town." Sheriff Taylor tugged nervously at his collar. "Mr. Mills, if there are allegations of financial impropriety—" "There are no improprieties," Mills thundered. "Only the desperate lies of a woman trying to avoid her legitimate debts." "Then you won't mind if I examine the bank's records," Sheriff Taylor said with surprising firmness, "just to reassure the good people of Silverwood." Mills's face darkened. "The bank's records are private." "Not when there's suspicion of criminal activity," the sheriff replied, seeming to find his courage. Mrs. Blackwood has made serious accusations. In fairness to all parties, they should be investigated. The crowd's mood was shifting palpably. Where minutes ago they had been united against Ruth Sullivan, now uncertainty and suspicion divided them. Several people were eyeing Mills with new wariness. Seeing his advantage slipping, Mills changed tactics. Very well. I have nothing to hide. Sheriff, you may review the bank's ledgers at your convenience. He turned to the crowd with a benevolent smile. Transparency is the cornerstone of trust, after all, and the Silverwood Bank values nothing more highly than your trust. Abigail wasn't fooled by the performance. Mills would find a way to delay the sheriff's investigation or manipulate the records before he arrived. But she had accomplished what she came for, creating doubt about Mills's motives and buying time. Now, Mills continued smoothly. As for the Sullivan woman, Ruth Sullivan will be released immediately, Abigail interrupted. Unless Sheriff Taylor can cite an actual law, she's broken. All eyes turned to the sheriff, who shifted uncomfortably. Well, technically, witchcraft isn't in the territorial statutes. And as for disturbing the peace, he glanced at Pastor Wilson, then back to the crowd. I'm not sure what specific disturbance. This is outrageous, Wilson exploded. She brought drought upon us with her heathen practices. Did she also bring the rain that ended it? Abigail asked pointedly. Or does your God get credit for the good, while Ruth Sullivan takes blame for the bad? Several townspeople, including Mrs. Cooper, nodded at this logic. Sheriff, Nathaniel said quietly, my grandmother has spent the night in a cell on charges that don't exist. I believe that constitutes false imprisonment. Sheriff Taylor's worried expression deepened. Now, Sullivan, no need to start throwing around legal terms. I'm quite familiar with legal terms, Nathaniel replied. More than you might expect. Something in his tone made the sheriff hesitate. After a moment's consideration, Taylor nodded. I suppose there's no harm in releasing Mrs. Sullivan until a proper hearing can be arranged, with actual charges. This is an affront to God's law, Wilson protested, but his voice had lost its earlier authority. God's law is for God to enforce, Pastor, Sheriff Taylor replied with unexpected wisdom. I'm tasked with upholding territorial law, and that doesn't include imprisoning old women for the weather. With that, he turned and re-entered the jailhouse. Minutes later, he emerged with Ruth Sullivan, who walked with dignified steps despite her night in jail. Her silver hair was slightly disheveled, but her dark eyes were clear and alert as they swept over the crowd, finding first Nathaniel, then Abigail. Grandma, Nathaniel said the single word, conveying a wealth of concern as he moved to her side. Ruth placed a weathered hand on his arm. I'm quite all right, grandson. It takes more than one night in Sheriff Taylor's jail to break this old woman. Her gaze settled on Pastor Wilson, who stood rigid with thwarted righteousness. You might want to check your Bible again, Pastor. Exodus 22:18 speaks of not suffering a witch to live true enough. But the original Hebrew word kashaf refers to those who use magic to harm, not to heal. I have never brought harm to anyone in Silverwood Valley. Wilson opened his mouth, then closed it again, clearly unprepared for a theological debate with the very woman he had denounced as a heathen. Ruth turned to Harrison Mills. As for you, Mr. Mills, I suggest you examine your conscience before you continue this campaign against my friend's daughter. She nodded toward Abigail. Some debts can't be repaid with money. Without waiting for a response, she linked her arm through Nathaniel's. Now, if you'll excuse us, my grandson and I have patients to attend to. Babies don't wait for witch trials to be born. As Ruth and Nathaniel moved through the now subdued crowd, Abigail followed, aware of the whispers that trailed in their wake. Harrison Mills's voice called after her. "This changes nothing, Mrs. Blackwood. Whispering Pines will be auctioned on Saturday unless the debt is paid in full." Abigail paused, turning to face him one final time. "Perhaps. But now everyone knows why you're so determined to take my land. I wonder how your depositors feel about entrusting their money to a bank that covers up embezzlement through foreclosure." With that, she continued on, leaving Mills to deal with the suddenly questioning looks of Silverwood's merchants and farmers. It wasn't victory, not yet. But for the first time since Oliver's death, Abigail felt the balance of power shifting. Saturday was still 5 days away. 5 days to find the silver her mother had hinted at. 5 days to save Whispering Pines. 5 days to reclaim the woman she had been before marriage had dulled her spirit. Ruth Sullivan's cabin showed no signs of the previous night's disturbance, save for a single broken window pane, now covered with a square of oiled paper. Inside, the fire burned cheerfully in the hearth, and the black cat, Midnight, lay stretched across the windowsill as if nothing had happened. "You should have let me take you home first, Grandma," Nathaniel said, as he helped Ruth into her rocking chair by the fire. "You need rest." "What I need is to be in my own home, with my own things," Ruth replied, though her voice betrayed more weariness than her words admitted. "Jail cells have poor energy for healing." Abigail stood awkwardly by the door, suddenly uncertain of her place in this family moment. "I should go. I just wanted to make sure you were safely home." "Nonsense, child. Sit." Ruth gestured to a chair opposite her own. "You stood up for an old woman against the most powerful men in Silverwood. That makes you family in my book." Nathaniel glanced between his grandmother and Abigail, his expression unreadable. "I'll make tea." He moved to the small kitchen area, filling a kettle with water from a bucket. As he worked, Abigail noticed his movements were methodical and precise, despite his scarred right hand. There was an unexpected grace to the way he measured tea leaves into a pot, his large fingers suddenly deft. "He learned that in medical school," Ruth said quietly, following Abigail's gaze, "before the war." Abigail turned to her in surprise. "Medical school Mr. Sullivan is a doctor." "Was," Nathaniel corrected from the kitchen, his back still turned. "That life ended long ago." Ruth sighed. "My grandson completed his training at Harvard Medical School in 1860. Then the war came, and he served as a surgeon with the Union Army." Abigail struggled to reconcile the quiet, scarred ranch hand with the image of a Harvard-educated doctor. "I had no idea." "Few do." Ruth accepted the cup of tea Nathaniel handed her. After the war, he established a practice in Chicago with his wife, Sophia. They worked together. She was a nurse, trained during the war. Nathaniel's jaw tightened at the mention of his wife's name. He handed a cup to Abigail without meeting her eyes, then moved to stand by the window, his back to the room. "What happened?" Abigail asked softly. For a long moment, the only sound was the crackling of the fire. Then Nathaniel spoke, his voice low and measured. "Fire happened. Our clinic was in a poor neighborhood, mostly immigrant families. One night, a lamp overturned in the apartment above. The building went up like tinder." He touched his scarred cheek unconsciously. "I was treating a child with pneumonia when the smoke started. Got the family out, went back for patient records. Sophia was upstairs checking on a woman who'd just delivered twins." He fell silent, the weight of memory pressing down like a physical force. Ruth continued gently. "The stairs collapsed before he could reach her. He tried to climb the outside of the building, but," she gestured to his scarred right side, "the burns were severe. By the time he was pulled away, it was too late for Sophia." I'm so sorry, Abigail whispered. Nathaniel turned from the window, his expression composed once more. It was 8 years ago, another lifetime. He met Abigail's gaze directly for perhaps the first time. Everyone has scars, Mrs. Blackwood. Some are just more visible than others. The simple truth of the statement resonated deeply. Abigail thought of her own invisible wounds, the years of Oliver's casual cruelty, the slow erosion of her confidence, the walls she had built around her heart. "Please," she said, "call me Abigail." Something shifted in Nathaniel's expression, a softening around the eyes, perhaps. "Abigail, then." Ruth watched this exchange with knowing eyes. "Now that we're properly acquainted, let's discuss why you really came to Silverwood today. It wasn't just to free an old woman from jail." Abigail smiled slightly. Ruth Sullivan missed very little. "I found something in my mother's journal, something about the spring on the North Ridge." Ruth nodded, unsurprised. "The silver traces. You know about them. Your mother discovered them years ago. She and your father debated whether to investigate further." Ruth sipped her tea. In the end, Thomas decided to honor his promise to the Blackfoot elders who had shown him the spring in the first place. They considered it sacred water not to be disturbed for material gain. "But if there's enough silver there, it could save Whispering Pines," Abigail said. "Surely that would honor my father's legacy better than losing the ranch entirely." "Perhaps," Ruth conceded, "though such decisions are rarely simple." She glanced at her grandson. "Nathaniel knows something about mining. His father, my son, was an engineer before he passed." Nathaniel frowned. "I'm no mining expert, but I know enough to tell you that establishing a productive silver mine takes time and capital months, not days. Even if there's a significant deposit there, you can't extract enough by Saturday to pay the bank." "But if I could prove the silver exists," Abigail pressed, "surely I could secure a loan against its future value, or find investors." "In 5 days," Nathaniel shook his head. "And who would you trust with this information? The moment Harrison Mills learns there might be silver on Whispering Pines, he'll have even more reason to foreclose." The truth of his words struck Abigail like a physical blow. She had been pinning her hopes on the silver, seeing it as the solution to all her problems. But Nathaniel was right. Even if she could prove its existence, she couldn't extract enough in time, and revealing the information prematurely would only make her situation worse. "Then what do I do?" The question emerged more vulnerable than she had intended. Ruth set down her teacup. "You fight with the weapons. You have not the ones you wish for." She leaned forward, her dark eyes intense. "Harrison Mills fears exposure. You saw that today. He'll do anything to prevent a full examination of the bank's records. But Sheriff Taylor is going to investigate." Ruth's smile held little humor. "Taylor is a good man at heart, but spineless when faced with true power. Mills will delay him, misdirect him, or simply doctor the books before he arrives. Your advantage lies elsewhere." "Where?" "In the court of public opinion," Nathaniel said suddenly. "You made people doubt today. Doubt is powerful. It spreads like fire in dry grass." Abigail considered this. "So I should continue to speak publicly about Oliver's embezzlement, about Mills covering it up." "Carefully," Ruth cautioned. "Direct accusations without proof make you look desperate. But questions make others curious, and curiosity leads people to their own discoveries." "Meanwhile," Nathaniel added, "we should examine the spring, not to mine it immediately, but to determine if the silver deposit is significant enough to be used as leverage." "We?" Abigail asked, surprised by his inclusion of himself in her problems. Nathaniel met her gaze steadily. You stood by my grandmother when few others would. Consider it repayment of a debt. No debt exists between us, Mr. Sullivan. Nathaniel, he corrected. And perhaps not. But I still offer my help if you'll accept it. The offer touched something in Abigail that had been dormant for years, a sense of not being entirely alone against the world. It was both comforting and frightening, this sudden alliance with the scarred doctor-turned-ranch hand and his wise grandmother. I accept, she said simply. And thank you. Both of you. Ruth nodded in satisfaction. Good. Now there's one more thing you should know about that spring. What's that? The Blackfoot called it medicine water for a reason. They believed it had healing properties beyond the physical, that it could mend wounded spirits and reveal hidden truths. Ruth's eyes held ancient wisdom. Your mother found her strength there when life's burdens grew heavy. Perhaps you will find yours as well. As Abigail rode back to Whispering Pines later that afternoon, she pondered Ruth's words. Her mother had indeed found something at that spring, perhaps not just silver traces, but also the courage to leave behind a map for her daughter. A path to salvation, if Abigail was brave enough to follow it. And now she had unexpected allies on that path. A scarred doctor who understood loss. A wise woman who connected past and present with threads of knowledge most had forgotten. For the first time since Oliver's death, since her marriage, really, Abigail felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. Not just hope. Possibility. The North Ridge gleamed in early morning light as Abigail and Nathaniel reached the clearing above the spring. They had ridden out from Whispering Pines at dawn, taking care not to attract attention from the ranch hands. Only Jesse Thornton knew their destination, and he had promised to keep their absence unremarked for as long as possible. Nathaniel dismounted with fluid grace that belied his size, then moved to help Abigail from her mare. His hands were strong and steady at her waist, lifting her down as if she weighed nothing. For a moment, they stood close enough that Abigail could see the different textures of his scar tissue, the way it pulled slightly at the corner of his right eye, the surprising gentleness in his expression despite the damage. He stepped back, releasing her, and the moment passed. The spring is just beyond those rocks, Abigail said, gesturing to the outcropping. Nathaniel nodded, retrieving a leather satchel from his saddlebag. I brought some tools for testing mineral content. Nothing sophisticated, but enough to give us an idea of what we're dealing with. They made their way to the spring in companionable silence. The pool was just as Abigail remembered, clear water bubbling from a crevice in the rock, surrounded by lush vegetation that seemed to thrive despite the recent drought. Kneeling beside the pool, Nathaniel opened his satchel and removed several glass vials, a small magnifying glass, and various powders in paper packets. You came prepared, Abigail observed. Medical training has its uses beyond the sick room. He filled one vial with water from the spring, then added a few grains of powder from one of the packets. The water turned faintly blue. What does that mean? She asked, kneeling beside him. There are dissolved minerals present more than in ordinary water. He held the vial to the light. That's promising, but not conclusive for silver specifically. Nathaniel set the vial aside and examined the rocks around the spring's source, occasionally scraping samples into another vial. His focus was complete, his movements precise and methodical. Abigail found herself watching his hands, the undamaged left with long, elegant fingers. The scarred right still dexterous, despite its appearance. You were a surgeon, she said, not quite a question. Yes. He continued his examination without looking up. Do you miss it, medicine? Now he paused, considering. Sometimes. The work itself, healing, making a difference? Yes, I miss that. He glanced at her briefly. but I don't miss the person I was then." "What do you mean?" Nathaniel resumed his work, scraping at a patch of rock where the water first emerged from the crevice. "I was arrogant, believed I could fix anything save everyone. The war should have taught me differently, but somehow I emerged even more convinced of my own importance." A humorless smile touched his lips. The fire corrected that misapprehension rather thoroughly. Abigail was struck by his candor and by the parallels to her own journey. "I understand. In a different way, perhaps, but I understand." "Your husband?" She nodded. "Oliver made me believe I was nothing without him, that everything good in my life came from his generosity. It took his death for me to see how he had diminished me piece by piece. And now I'm trying to remember who I was before. The girl who rode these hills without fear, who believed she could manage a ranch as well as any man." Abigail touched the surface of the spring, watching ripples spread from her fingers. "She feels very far away sometimes." "Not as far as you think," Nathaniel said quietly. Before she could respond, he held up a small stone, inspecting it through his magnifying glass. "Look at this." Abigail leaned closer. The stone appeared ordinary at first glance, but as water from the spring dried on its surface, tiny flecks caught the sunlight glinting silver-white against the darker matrix. "Is that?" "Silver ore," Nathaniel confirmed. "Not high grade, but definitely present." He examined the rock face more closely. "And judging by the formation, this isn't just trace elements in the water. There's a vein here following the same fissure that feeds the spring." Excitement surged through Abigail. "How extensive do you think it is?" "Impossible to say without proper mining equipment. It could be a small deposit limited to this outcropping, or it could extend deep into the ridge." He sat back on his heels, considering. "Either way, it's significant enough to warrant investigation by mining experts." "So I was right. There is silver here." "Yes, your mother's observations were correct." Nathaniel carefully placed the stone sample in a small cloth bag. "The question remains, what do you do with this knowledge?" Abigail gazed at the spring, thinking of her mother coming to this place for solace, discovering the silver, keeping the secret out of respect for her husband's promise to the Blackfoot elders. "I need to think," she said finally. "This isn't just about saving the ranch anymore. It's about honoring my father's word versus preserving his legacy." Nathaniel nodded, understanding the moral complexity of her position. "Take your time. I'll continue gathering samples." While he worked, Abigail wandered a few paces away, following the small stream that flowed from the spring down the slope. The water caught sunlight as it tumbled over rocks, creating miniature rainbows in the spray. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. "The strength of a woman lies not in what she owns, but in what she believes." What did she believe? That Whispering Pines was worth saving, certainly. That Harrison Mills should not profit from his son's crimes. That the land her parents had nurtured should not be carved up for railroad tracks and mining operations. But did those beliefs justify breaking her father's promise to respect the sacred spring? A sound behind her interrupted her thoughts. Nathaniel had moved to the edge of the clearing and was staring intently down the trail they had ascended. "Someone's coming," he said, his voice low. "Two riders." Abigail hurried to his side. In the distance, she could make out two figures on horseback, making their way up the ridge trail. "Can you tell who it is?" Nathaniel shook his head. "Not yet, but they're heading directly for the spring." "We should hide the samples," Abigail said, suddenly fearful that Harrison Mills had somehow learned of their expedition. "Too late for that. Better to meet them openly than appear to be sneaking about." Nathaniel straightened to his full height, positioning himself slightly in front of Abigail as the riders drew closer. To Abigail's surprise, she recognized the lead writer as Dr. Samuel Reynolds Silverwood's only physician, a man who had begun calling at Whispering Pines with increasing regularity since Oliver's death. Behind him rode Isaiah Matthews, the widowed owner of Silverwood's leather goods store, another of her persistent suitors. "Mrs. Blackwood," Dr. Reynolds called as they approached the clearing. "What a pleasant surprise to find you here." Abigail doubted very much that their meeting was a surprise. Someone at Whispering Pines must have mentioned her early morning departure with Nathaniel. "Dr. Reynolds? Mr. Matthews." She nodded to each man in turn. "What brings you to the North Ridge?" Reynolds dismounted with practiced elegance, his tailored riding coat unmarred by dust despite the journey. "Concern for your welfare, my dear lady. When I heard you had ridden out unescorted to this remote area—" "I'm hardly unescorted," Abigail replied, gesturing to Nathaniel. Reynolds's eyes narrowed as he took in Nathaniel's scarred visage, recognition dawning. "Ah, the Sullivan fellow. Yes, I suppose a ranch hand is better than no protection at all." His tone made it clear that he considered such company barely adequate. Matthews dismounted as well, his round face flushed from the ride. Unlike Reynolds, he acknowledged Nathaniel with a nod, before turning to Abigail. "Mrs. Blackwood, we heard about the commotion in town yesterday. I want you to know that not everyone believes the rumors about your financial situation." His expression was earnest, his manner more genuine than Reynolds. "If you're in need of assistance, my offer of partnership still stands." Abigail had declined Matthews's marriage proposal 3 times already. Each time he had reframed it as a business partnership, though his true intentions remained transparent. "That's very kind, Mr. Matthews, but, as I've said before, I intend to manage Whispering Pines independently." "Even with the bank's deadline approaching," Reynolds interjected, his tone solicitous but his eyes sharp. "My dear, there's no shame in accepting help when circumstances grow dire." Nathaniel shifted beside her, his stance protective without being possessive. "Mrs. Blackwood has matters well in hand, gentlemen. Your concern, while noted, is unnecessary." Reynolds bristled at being addressed by someone he clearly considered beneath his station. "I don't believe I was speaking to you, Sullivan." "Yet I was speaking to you, Dr. Reynolds." Nathaniel's voice remained even, but there was steel beneath the surface. "And as Mrs. Blackwood's associate in this particular endeavor, I suggest we all maintain civil discourse." "Associate?" Matthews echoed, glancing between Nathaniel and Abigail with new speculation. "What exactly is your business here, if I might ask?" Abigail thought quickly. Revealing their discovery of silver would be disastrous, potentially bringing a flood of prospectors to Whispering Pines before she had decided how to proceed. "Mr. Sullivan is helping me assess water resources for the upcoming summer," she improvised. "This spring never failed during the recent drought, and we're considering how to channel it more effectively for livestock." Reynolds looked skeptical, but Matthews nodded in understanding. Practical thinking. Water rights are becoming increasingly valuable in these parts. Indeed. Abigail agreed, relieved that at least one of her visitors seemed to accept the explanation. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we have measurements to complete before returning to the ranch." "Perhaps we could assist," Reynolds suggested, clearly unwilling to leave. "4 heads are better than 2, after all." "That's very kind," Abigail replied with forced politeness. "But we've nearly finished our work here. Though since you've made the journey, you're welcome to refresh yourselves at the spring before returning to town." While Matthews moved gratefully to drink from the cool water, Reynolds remained beside Abigail, lowering his voice confidentially. "Mrs. Blackwood, Abigail, may I speak frankly? You usually do doctor." He smiled thinly at her retort. Your association with the Sullivans is causing talk in Silverwood. First the old woman, now the scarred grandson. People are beginning to question your judgment. Are they, or is it just you who questions it? I speak only out of concern for your reputation. Reynolds glanced toward Nathaniel, who was showing Matthews the plants growing around the spring, keeping him occupied and away from their conversation. A woman in your position cannot afford social missteps, not with the auction so close. And what position is that exactly? A widow of means or former means without male protection in a territory where such protection is essential. Reynolds's tone softened to what he clearly believed was kindness. I've made no secret of my admiration for you, Abigail. My offer of marriage would solve many problems at once. The bank would be more inclined to negotiate if you had a husband of appropriate standing, and the unfortunate association with the Sullivans could be quietly forgotten. Abigail stared at him, momentarily speechless at his presumption. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but clear. Dr. Reynolds, let me be equally frank. I will never marry again for convenience or social standing. My first experience with such an arrangement taught me its true cost. Oliver Blackwood was not a gentleman, Reynolds said dismissively. You cannot judge all men by his example. Perhaps not, but I can judge them by their own words and actions. She met his gaze directly. And your concern for my reputation, rather than my happiness, tells me everything I need to know about your character. Reynolds' face tightened. You're making a mistake, Abigail. Without a husband's protection, you'll lose everything: the ranch, your standing in the community, your future security. Then I'll lose them on my own terms, not as an appendage to a man who values appearances above truth. Abigail moved past him toward the spring where Nathaniel and Matthews stood. Now, if you'll excuse me, Mr. Sullivan and I have work to complete. Reynolds remained motionless for a moment, his expression a mix of anger and disbelief at being so directly refused. Then, composing himself, he followed her to the spring. Matthews, he said sharply, we should return to town. Mrs. Blackwood and her associate wish to continue their work uninterrupted. Matthews looked surprised at the abrupt departure, but nodded agreeably. Of course, Mrs. Blackwood, thank you for your hospitality. He hesitated, then added, my offer remains open should circumstances change. Thank you, Mr. Matthews. You're a kind man. And he was. Abigail reflected misguided in his persistent courtship, but fundamentally decent in a way Reynolds could never understand. As the two men mounted their horses and departed down the trail, Abigail released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. That was well handled, Nathaniel observed quietly. Was it, I fear I may have made an enemy of Dr. Reynolds? He was never your friend to begin with. Nathaniel's gaze followed the retreating riders. Men like that see women as property to be acquired, not people to be respected. Like Oliver, Abigail murmured. Yes, Nathaniel turned back to the spring. We should finish our work here quickly. Reynolds isn't the type to accept rejection gracefully. He'll likely spread word of our meeting here, casting it in the worst possible light. Let him, Abigail said with sudden determination. I've spent too many years worrying about what others think. It's time I lived by my own judgment. Nathaniel studied her for a moment, something like admiration flickering in his eyes. Your mother would be proud of that sentiment. The simple statement touched Abigail deeply. Do you think so? Ruth speaks often of Elizabeth Harrington's independent spirit, how she defied convention to marry a rancher, to learn healing arts from a woman of color, to raise a daughter who could ride and shoot as well as any boy. Nathaniel's scarred mouth curved in a slight smile. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree, it seems. As they continued their examination of the spring gathering samples and making notes about the surrounding terrain, Abigail felt a growing sense of connection, not just to Nathaniel, but to her own past. To the girl she had been before marriage had taught her to doubt herself, to shrink her voice, to measure her worth through a husband's eyes. That girl had believed in possibilities. Perhaps it was time Abigail Harrington did too. The ride back to Whispering Pines was companionable, filled with discussion of their findings and plans for further investigation of the silver deposit. As they approached the ranch, however, Abigail noticed unusual activity in the yard, several wagons and horses that didn't belong to her ranch hands. "Something's happening," she said, urging her mare to a faster pace. Nathaniel matched her speed, his expression alert. "Visitors, quite a few of them." They rode into the yard to find a gathering of at least a dozen people, farmers and merchants from Silverwood women Abigail recognized from church socials, even Sheriff Taylor standing awkwardly by the porch steps. Leonidas hurried forward to take their horses. "Miss Abigail," he said in a low voice, "they've been arriving for the past hour. Word of yesterday's confrontation has spread. They're asking questions about the bank." Abigail dismounted, suddenly aware of her disheveled appearance after hours on the ridge. "What kind of questions?" "About their money, about Oliver's dealings, about what you said regarding embezzlement." Leonidas glanced at the gathered townsfolk. "They're scared, miss. Many have their life savings in Mills Bank." Nathaniel stepped closer, his voice pitched for Abigail's ears alone. "This is an opportunity. Use it wisely." She nodded, gathering her courage, and approached the assembled visitors. "Good afternoon, everyone. This is an unexpected gathering." Mrs. Cooper, the blacksmith's wife, stepped forward. "Mrs. Blackwood, we've come about what you said in town yesterday, about Oliver taking money from the bank." Several others murmured agreement, their faces anxious. "Is it true?" asked Mr. Dawson, who owned the general store. "Are our deposits at risk?" Abigail looked at the worried faces before her hard-working people whose security hung on her next words. She thought of Ruth's advice: questions make others curious, and curiosity leads people to their own discoveries. "I found documents in my husband's possession indicating he had made investments using funds that weren't his to invest," she said carefully. "Whether those funds came from bank deposits I cannot say with absolute certainty. But I believe Harrison Mills' eagerness to foreclose on Whispering Pines may be motivated by more than simple debt collection." "Mills says you're making wild accusations because you're about to lose your ranch," Sheriff Taylor interjected. "Says you have no proof." "I have Oliver's papers," Abigail replied evenly, "including correspondence with his father about covering up losses. I'm happy to share them with you, Sheriff, as part of your investigation." Taylor shifted uncomfortably. "About that, Mills says the bank's records are only available during regular business hours with proper authorization from the Territorial Banking Commissioner." "How convenient," Nathaniel remarked dryly. "And how long does it take to obtain such authorization?" "2 weeks minimum," Taylor admitted. "Maybe longer." The crowd's murmurs grew more concerned. "2 weeks gives him plenty of time to alter records," said Mrs. Cooper boldly. "My Jacob has $300 in that bank, our entire savings." Others voiced similar concerns, the anxiety in the yard palpable. Abigail raised her hands for quiet. "I understand your fears. I share them. But causing a panic won't help anyone." "What should we do then?" Dawson asked. "Withdraw our money before there's nothing left." "If everyone withdraws at once, the bank will certainly fail," Abigail pointed out. "Even honest banks keep only a portion of deposits on hand." "Then we're trapped," Mrs. Cooper said bitterly. Leave our money and risk losing it, or withdraw it and cause the very collapse we fear." Nathaniel stepped forward, his scarred face causing a momentary hush as those who hadn't seen him before registered his appearance. "There is a third option," he said, his deep voice carrying across the yard. "Demand transparency, not as individuals, but as a community." The crowd listened, initial shock at his scarred visage, giving way to attention to his words. "Harrison Mills values his reputation above all else," Nathaniel continued. "He can delay one person's questions, but not an entire town's. If you stand together, merchants, farmers, depositors, and demand an immediate audit of the bank's books by independent examiners, he will have to comply or risk losing all credibility." "Who would conduct such an audit?" asked a farmer Abigail didn't immediately recognize. "Mills owns the only bank for 50 miles. "The Territorial Banking Commissioner in Helena," Nathaniel replied. "Telegraph him directly with your concerns. Request an emergency examination." Sheriff Taylor frowned. "That's irregular procedure. Normally, complaints go through local channels first." "These are irregular circumstances," Abigail said. "A bank president whose son may have embezzled funds, followed by a suspicious fire, and now a rushed foreclosure on valuable property, all while blocking normal investigation channels." The logic of her argument was apparent to everyone present. After a moment's consideration, Dawson nodded decisively. "I'll draft the telegram myself. As president of the Silverwood Merchants Association, my request will carry weight." He glanced around at his neighbors. "Who will sign with me?" Nearly every hand raised, including Sheriff Taylor's, albeit with visible reluctance. "Good," Abigail said, feeling a surge of hope. "The telegraph office closes at 5. You should go now." As the visitors began to disperse, Nathaniel moved to Abigail's side. "Well done," he murmured. "You've given them agency without creating panic." "Will it work?" she asked quietly. "Will it buy enough time?" "Perhaps. But Mills won't take this lying down. When cornered men like him become dangerous." Abigail watched the last wagon leave the yard, dust settling in its wake. "Then we need to move quickly with our own plans for the silver deposit." "Agreed. I'll return to the ridge tomorrow with better equipment. If the vein is as promising as I suspect, we may have leverage beyond mere accusations." As they turned toward the house, Mrs. Finch appeared on the porch, her expression troubled. "Miss Abigail, there's a visitor waiting in the study. Been here nearly an hour." "Who?" "Mr. William Reed, from the railroad company. Says he has a proposition that won't wait." Abigail and Nathaniel exchanged glances. The Northern Pacific Railroad had been trying to secure right-of-way across Whispering Pines for years, offering increasingly generous sums that her father had consistently refused. "The vultures circle," Nathaniel observed grimly. "Perhaps," Abigail replied. "Or perhaps this is another opportunity in disguise." With renewed determination, she straightened her shoulders and moved toward the house. One more battle in a war she was increasingly determined to win, not just for herself, but for everyone Harrison Mills had wronged. Including, she realized with surprise, the scarred doctor who now stood steadfastly at her side. William Reed stood at the study window when Abigail entered, his tall frame silhouetted against the afternoon light. He turned at the sound of the door, revealing a lean face weathered by years of outdoor work, intelligent eyes assessing her from beneath bushy brows. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, his voice carrying the slight twang of the eastern seaboard. "Thank you for seeing me. I apologize for arriving unannounced." "Mr. Reed." Abigail remained by the door, deliberately not inviting him to sit. "What brings Northern Pacific to Whispering Pines today?" Reed smiled slightly at her directness. "News travels fast in small communities, Mrs. Blackwood. we've heard of your difficulties with Silverwood Bank, and you thought to take advantage of those difficulties. I prefer to think of it as presenting a mutually beneficial alternative. Reed removed a folded document from his coat pocket. I'm authorized to offer $40,000 for the eastern section of Whispering Pines, approximately 800 acres, including the ridge that borders our existing line. Abigail kept her expression neutral, though her heart raced at the mention of the ridge where they had just discovered silver. That's considerably more than you've offered in the past. The railroad's needs have grown more urgent. The Helena Spur must be completed by year's end to fulfill our contract with the territorial government. And you've just now decided my land is essential to this timeline. After years of taking no for an answer, Abigail allowed skepticism to color her tone. Curious timing, Mr. Reed. Reed had the grace to look slightly abashed. I won't insult your intelligence by denying that your current financial predicament makes this an opportune moment for Northern Pacific. But the offer is genuine and more than fair. And the offer would cover my debt to the bank with a handsome profit. Besides, Abigail acknowledged, but it would also divide Whispering Pines nearly in half, separating the ranch house from the North Ridge and the best water sources on the property. Hence the generous compensation. Reed placed the document on her father's desk. $40,000 would allow you to develop new water resources on the western section. You could even purchase adjacent properties as they become available, eventually replacing the acreage lost. The proposal was tempting, far more tempting than Abigail wanted to admit. With the bank's deadline just 4 days away, Reed was offering an immediate solution that would leave her with money in hand and still holding the majority of her ranch. But the North Ridge would be lost. The spring, the silver deposit, and most importantly, the land her father had promised to protect. What do you know of the North Ridge, Mr. Reed? She asked carefully. Reed's expression remained professionally neutral. It provides the most direct route for our spur line, avoiding costly elevation changes and reducing construction time by approximately 6 weeks. I mean, geologically, has Northern Pacific surveyed the mineral potential of the ridge? A flicker of something surprised concern crossed Reed's features before he composed them again. Our surveys focus primarily on grade and stability for track laying, Mrs. Blackwood. We're in the transportation business, not mining. Abigail wasn't entirely convinced by his response. The railroad had extensive geological surveys conducted throughout their territory, often discovering valuable mineral deposits long before local residents were aware of them. Yet the railroad owns several mining subsidiaries, she observed, and has first access to shipping contracts for new discoveries along your routes. Reed studied her with new interest. You're well informed for a ranch owner, Mrs. Blackwood. My father believed knowledge was the best defense against exploitation. She moved fully into the study, taking a seat behind her father's desk, a deliberate power position. So I'll ask again, what do you know about the North Ridge that makes it suddenly worth $40,000 when last year you offered $12,000? For a long moment, Reed stood silent, weighing his response. Finally he sighed and settled into the chair opposite her. Northern Pacific conducted extensive geological surveys of this region last winter, he admitted. They indicated potential silver deposits in several areas, including the North Ridge of Whispering Pines. However, the findings were preliminary and inconclusive without more invasive testing, which would require owner permission, Abigail concluded. Precisely. And your late husband was disinterested in further discussion after our initial approaches. Reed leaned forward. Mrs. Blackwood, I'm not authorized to confirm specific mineral findings, but I am authorized to make this offer which reflects the property's potential value beyond mere grazing land. In other words, Northern Pacific suspects there's silver, but isn't certain enough to offer mining rights instead of purchasing outright. Reed's slight smile acknowledged her astuteness. You would have made an excellent negotiator, Mrs. Blackwood. I am an excellent negotiator, Mr. Reed, which is why I'm declining your offer at this time. The bank's deadline is my concern, not yours. Abigail rose, signaling the end of their meeting. Thank you for your candor, but Whispering Pines is not for sale, neither in whole nor in part. Reed stood gathering the unsigned document. This offer expires when the bank's deadline does, Mrs. Blackwood. Saturday at noon. After that, we'll negotiate with whoever holds the deed. Then I suggest you prepare for disappointment, Abigail replied, though her confidence was more performance than reality. Good day, Mr. Reed. After showing him out, Abigail returned to the study and sank into her father's chair, the weight of her situation pressing down with renewed force. Reed's offer confirmed the value of the silver deposit, but didn't solve her immediate problem. Even with proof of silver, she couldn't extract enough by Saturday to pay the bank. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Nathaniel stood in the doorway, his expression questioning. The railroad man has departed, he observed, looking rather disgruntled. I declined his offer. How generous was it? 40,000 for the eastern section, including the North Ridge. Abigail ran a hand through her loosened hair. He as good as admitted they suspect silver deposits. Nathaniel entered the study, closing the door behind him. That's useful knowledge, but it doesn't solve the Saturday deadline. No, Abigail agreed wearily. Nothing seems to. Perhaps we're approaching this from the wrong direction. Nathaniel took the seat Reed had vacated, his large frame, making the chair seem suddenly smaller. Instead of trying to pay the debt or prove the silver deposit in 4 days, what if we focused on proving Mills's corruption? That might force a postponement of the auction. Sheriff Taylor is already investigating, but Mills has delayed access to the bank's records. The sheriff isn't our only potential ally. Nathaniel leaned forward, his scarred face intent. What about the territorial banking commissioner, the same one the townsfolk are telegraphing today? Abigail considered this. You think he might intervene directly? If presented with compelling evidence, yes. Banking fraud is a serious crime in the territories where financial institutions are still establishing trust. Nathaniel's medical training showed in his precise analysis. The commissioner would have authority to freeze all bank actions pending investigation, including foreclosures. Hope stirred again in Abigail's chest. We'd need to present the evidence in person. Helena is 2 days' ride each way. I could leave at first light tomorrow, Nathaniel offered, with the documents from Oliver's strongbox. No, Abigail said firmly. This is my fight. If anyone goes to Helena, it should be me. It's not safe for a woman to make that journey alone. Then come with me, she said impulsively. We'll both go. Nathaniel seemed taken aback by the suggestion. The town is already gossiping about our association. A 2-day journey together would destroy what remains of your reputation. My reputation? Abigail laughed, a sound with more bitterness than humor. The wife of an embezzler facing foreclosure, accused of consorting with witches, what reputation remains to protect? More than you realize, Nathaniel said quietly. You're still respected, Abigail, still seen as a woman of principle. That counts for something in places like Silverwood. His concern touched her, but Abigail had moved beyond such considerations. Let them talk. I'd rather save my ranch with a tarnished reputation than lose it with an untarnished one. For a moment, Nathaniel studied her face, seeing perhaps the determination that had been reawakening day by day. Then he nodded, once decision made. We leave at dawn, 2 fast horses traveling light. If we push hard, we can reach Helena by tomorrow night, meet with the commissioner on Thursday, and be back before the Saturday deadline. Cutting it very close, Abigail observed. Close victories are still victories. Nathaniel rose. I'll make preparations and inform Leonidas of our plans. Not everyone, Abigail cautioned. The fewer people who know our destination, the better. Harrison Mills has eyes everywhere. Agreed. Nathaniel paused at the door. Pack only what's essential, and bring all of Oliver's documents. The commissioner will need every piece of evidence we can provide. After he left, Abigail remained in her father's chair, the familiar scent of leather and pipe tobacco lingering in the worn upholstery. Thomas Harrington had built Whispering Pines from wilderness, defending it against drought, harsh winters, and the constant pressure to sell to larger interests. Now, she would defend it too, not just with her father's stubborn determination, but with her own growing strength. A strength she had forgotten during her years with Oliver, but was rediscovering day by day. With Ruth Sullivan's wisdom, with Nathaniel's unexpected alliance, and with the courage that had been her birthright all along. Dawn couldn't come soon enough. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten when Abigail stepped onto the porch of Whispering Pine's saddlebags over her shoulder, and her father's old duster coat, protecting her from the pre-dawn chill. The yard was quiet, most of the ranch hands still asleep, but Nathaniel Sullivan stood waiting by the corral with 2 saddled horses, her mare Belle and his bay gelding. Leonidas Carson emerged from the shadows of the barn, his weathered face solemn in the gray light. Miss Abigail, everything's prepared as you asked. 2 days' provisions, canteens filled, and your father's old revolver in the right saddlebag. Thank you, Leonidas. She handed him a sealed envelope. If we're not back by Saturday noon, give this to Sheriff Taylor. It contains all the evidence against Harrison Mills with instructions to forward it to the territorial governor. Leonidas tucked the envelope securely inside his vest. Yes, ma'am. And what should I tell folks who come asking after you? The truth, but not the whole truth. I've gone to seek assistance regarding the bank's foreclosure. No need to mention Helena or the banking commissioner specifically. Understood. Leonidas glanced toward Nathaniel, his expression unreadable. Sullivan knows these trails better than most. You'll make good time. Abigail followed his gaze. In the dim light, Nathaniel's scarred profile seemed less stark, almost handsome in its rugged way. He handled the horses with quiet confidence, checking cinches and bridles with practiced hands. He's a good man, Leonidas added softly, despite what folks say. Yes, Abigail agreed, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. I believe he is. Leonidas nodded, satisfied. Your father would approve, I think. Not of the circumstances, perhaps, but of the man. Thomas Harrington valued character above appearances. The comparison to her father touched something deep in Abigail's heart. Thomas had indeed judged people by their actions rather than their station or appearance, a quality she had almost forgotten during her years with Oliver, who cared for little beyond social standing and material wealth. We should go, Nathaniel called softly. Want to clear Silverwood Valley before the town wakes. Abigail embraced Leonidas briefly, then moved to the corral where Nathaniel waited. He helped her mount with the same effortless strength he had shown on their ridge expedition, his hands steady and respectful at her waist. Ready? He asked, swinging onto his own horse. Abigail took one last look at the ranch house, the home her parents had built where she had known both great happiness and crushing sorrow. The first pink-gold rays of sunrise touched its white clappered walls, making it glow against the dark pines behind. Ready, she replied, turning her gaze forward. Let's ride. They left Whispering Pines by the North Trail, avoiding Silverwood Town entirely. The morning air was crisp and sweet, with pine resin, the world still wrapped in the hushed anticipation that precedes full daylight. Their horses moved at a steady trot, hooves muffled by the soft earth of the trail. As they crested a small rise, Nathaniel reined in his gelding, gesturing for Abigail to do the same. Below them stretched Silverwood Valley, a patchwork of ranches, small farms, and wild meadows nestled between forested ridges. The town itself was just visible in the distance, a cluster of buildings with a single church steeple rising above the rest. "It's beautiful in this light," Abigail said softly. "Almost like my father's stories of how it looked when they first settled here." Nathaniel nodded. "My grandmother says this valley has good spirits. Even the worst people can't spoil that entirely." "Or do you believe in spirits, Nathaniel?" He considered the question with characteristic thoughtfulness. "I believe in things beyond our immediate understanding. Medical school taught me the mechanics of the body, but not why some patients with identical injuries recover while others fade. The war showed me men dying despite perfect treatment, and others surviving wounds that should have been fatal." His scarred hand rested lightly on his saddle horn. "There are patterns beneath the surface of things, currents we can sense, but not always explain. Your grandmother would call that wisdom, not superstition." "She would." His mouth curved in a slight smile. "Grandma Ruth sees connections where others see coincidence. Most people call that witchcraft. I call it paying attention." They continued on, following game trails that wound through stands of ponderosa pine and across small, rushing creeks, still high with spring runoff. Nathaniel led with quiet confidence, occasionally pointing out landmarks or signs of wildlife. By mid-morning, they had left Silverwood Valley behind, entering higher country where the air grew cooler and views stretched for miles across rolling forested terrain. "We're making good time," Nathaniel observed during a brief stop to rest the horses. "Should reach the Helena Road by midday, then it's a straight shot to the city." Abigail took a drink from her canteen, studying her companion's profile as he scanned the horizon. In the full light of day, his scars were clearly visible, a network of tissue that pulled at his right cheek and extended down his neck beneath his collar. Yet she found she no longer noticed them as she had at first. Instead, she saw the intelligence in his eyes, the quiet strength in his bearing, the careful way he treated every living thing they encountered. "What will you do after Saturday?" she asked suddenly. "If we're successful, I mean." Nathaniel seemed surprised by the question. "Continue working at Whispering Pines, I suppose, if you'll have me." "And if we're not successful, if the ranch is sold?" A shadow crossed his face. "I hadn't thought that far ahead. Help Grandma Ruth, perhaps. She's getting older, though she'd never admit it. Or move on to another ranch." Not return to medicine. The question had been in Abigail's mind since learning of his past. Nathaniel was silent for a long moment. "That life feels very far away now. And these," he gestured to his scarred right hand, "make delicate surgical work impossible. But there are other aspects of medicine. Your knowledge hasn't been lost with your dexterity. Knowledge without confidence is of little use to patients," he replied, his tone suggesting the subject was closed. "We should continue if we want to reach Helena by nightfall." They rode on in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. By early afternoon, they reached the main road to Helena, a well-traveled dirt track wide enough for wagons with occasional wheel ruts hardened by the spring sun. "More exposed here," Nathaniel observed, scanning the surrounding countryside. "But faster going." "Do you expect trouble?" Abigail asked, noting his vigilance. Best to assume Mills knows we've left Whispering Pines by now. He has friends throughout the territory who might take an interest in delaying our journey. Nathaniel adjusted his hat against the afternoon sun. We'll push hard until dusk, then find a sheltered place to make camp. True to his word, Nathaniel set a brisk pace, their horses alternating between trotting and cantering along the smoother sections of road. They passed occasional travelers' freight wagons headed toward mining camps, solitary riders who nodded in greeting a family in a farm wagon who stared openly at Nathaniel's scarred visage before quickly averting their eyes. As the sun began its westward descent, the distant buildings of Helena appeared on the horizon. First, just the tallest structures, then gradually the sprawling outskirts of a city, experiencing the growing pains of territorial prosperity. "We won't reach the city before dark," Nathaniel said, studying the diminishing light. "And the commissioner's office will be closed anyway. Better to camp now and arrive fresh in the morning." He led them off the main road, following a small stream through a stand of cottonwoods until they reached a natural clearing sheltered by large boulders. The spot offered both privacy and protection from the wind that had begun to rise with evening's approach. "You've camped here before," Abigail observed, noting the existing fire ring of stones and the well-used hitching post fashioned from a fallen tree. "A few times," Nathaniel acknowledged as he dismounted, "when traveling between Helena and Silverwood. It's known to a few regulars on this route, but seldom used this early in the season." They worked together efficiently to make Camp Nathaniel, tending to the horses, while Abigail gathered firewood and prepared a simple meal from their provisions. By the time darkness fell completely, a small fire burned cheerfully within the stone ring, and coffee bubbled in a battered pot at its edge. Sitting across the fire from each other, they ate in comfortable silence for a time, beef jerky, hard biscuits, and dried apples softened by the coffee. The night sounds of the Montana wilderness surrounded them, an owl's distant call, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, the gentle gurgle of the stream nearby. "My father would have liked you," Abigail said suddenly, the thought arriving fully formed in her mind. Nathaniel looked up, surprise evident in his expression. "What makes you say that?" He valued competence, self-reliance, and kindness shown without expectation of reward or recognition. She gestured to the camp Nathaniel had helped establish with quiet efficiency. "All qualities you possess in abundance." A hint of color rose in the unscarred portion of his face. "High praise coming from you." Thomas Harrington was well respected throughout the territory. He was also stubborn, opinionated, and occasionally wrong, Abigail added with a small smile, "qualities I seem to have inherited in abundance." "Along with his courage," Nathaniel observed. "Not many would challenge Harrison Mills publicly, knowing the power he wields." "It wasn't courage at first," Abigail admitted. "Just desperation. But now—" She gazed into the fire, gathering her thoughts. "Now it feels like something more, like reclaiming a part of myself I'd lost." "Your father's daughter, emerging from beneath Oliver Blackwood's wife." The simple truth of the statement struck Abigail deeply. "Yes, exactly that." She looked up at him across the dancing flames. "How did you know?" Nathaniel's expression softened. "I've watched you these past days, seen you stand straighter, speak more confidently, make decisions without second-guessing yourself. It's like watching someone wake from a long sleep." "While you've been falling into one," Abigail replied, the insight arising unbidden. "What do you mean?" The doctor hiding inside the ranch hand, the man of education and healing who now tends horses instead of people. She leaned forward slightly, firelight illuminating her earnest expression. "You said my father's daughter is emerging. Perhaps it's time for the healer in you to do the same." Nathaniel's jaw tightened, his gaze shifting to the fire. "Some wounds can't be healed, Abigail. Some failures leave permanent scars. The fire wasn't your fault. You couldn't have saved everyone. I should have saved her." The words emerged rough with suppressed emotion. "Sophia was only in that building because of me, because I insisted on maintaining a clinic in a poor neighborhood against her family's advice. Because my arrogance told me I knew better than everyone else." Abigail heard the echoes of long-held guilt in his voice. "And you've punished yourself ever since by denying the world your gifts." "My gifts?" He held up his scarred right hand. "A surgeon who can't hold a scalpel steady. A doctor whose appearance frightens children and disturbs the sick. What good are those gifts now?" "The same good they've always been," Abigail replied firmly. "Your knowledge, your compassion, your ability to see people as they truly are, not as society labels them." She gestured to herself. "You saw me not as Oliver's widow or a failing ranch owner, but as a woman finding her strength again. That's a healer's vision, Nathaniel, whether you acknowledge it or not." For a long moment, he was silent, the crackling fire the only sound between them. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, touched with vulnerability she hadn't heard before. "Sometimes I dream I'm still in that burning building. The smoke is everywhere, and I can hear Sophia calling for help, but I can never reach her in time." His gaze remained fixed on the flames. "Other times I dream I'm back in my Chicago practice, and patients come in, take one look at my face, and flee in terror." "Dreams reflect our fears, not our realities," Abigail said gently. "Your grandmother taught me that. Grandma Ruth has wisdom I'm still learning to appreciate." He looked up at last, meeting her gaze across the fire. "As do you, Abigail Harrington." The use of her maiden name, deliberate, respectful, warmed something in Abigail's chest more thoroughly than the fire before them. For several heartbeats, they simply looked at each other, a current of unspoken understanding flowing between them. Then Nathaniel cleared his throat, breaking the moment. "We should rest. Tomorrow will be challenging enough without exhaustion clouding our judgment." He arranged their bedrolls on opposite sides of the fire, maintaining propriety despite their isolation. As Abigail settled beneath her blanket, she watched Nathaniel check the horses one last time, his movements fluid and assured in the firelight. A good man, Leonidas had called him. Perhaps even more than that, a healing presence in her life when she needed it most. Whether they saved Whispering Pines or lost it, Abigail realized she had already gained something precious on this journey, the rediscovery of her own heart. With that comforting thought, she drifted into the most peaceful sleep she had known in years. The Territorial Banking Commissioner's office occupied a modest brick building near the center of Helena, its unassuming facade belying the power it wielded over the financial institutions of Montana Territory. Abigail and Nathaniel arrived shortly after 9 o'clock, having entered the city at dawn, and stopped only long enough to refresh themselves at a public washroom. "Remember," Nathaniel said quietly as they approached the building, "Commissioner Holloway has a reputation for integrity but also for strict adherence to protocol. We need to present our evidence clearly and concisely." Abigail nodded, smoothing her travel-worn skirt. Despite their early morning attempts to make themselves presentable, they both showed signs of their journey dust on their clothing, fatigue around their eyes. But Abigail stood straight, Oliver's documents securely in her satchel, determination in every line of her posture. "Mr. Sullivan, what a surprise." The voice came from behind them, cultured and vaguely familiar. They turned to find Dr. Samuel Reynolds dismounting from a handsome black horse, his clothing immaculate despite being on horseback, his expression a study in false bonhomie. "Dr. Reynolds," Nathaniel acknowledged stiffly, "I wouldn't have expected to find you in Helena." "Business with the Territorial Medical Board," Reynolds replied, his gaze shifting to Abigail. "Mrs. Blackwood, how unexpected to encounter you so far from home, and in such company." Abigail lifted her chin slightly. "Mr. Sullivan has been kind enough to accompany me on business of my own. Business that couldn't wait for more suitable arrangements or more suitable companionship." Reynolds's tone remained pleasant, but his meaning was unmistakable. "People will talk, you know." "People already talk, Dr. Reynolds," Abigail replied coolly. "I've learned to concern myself with justice rather than gossip." Reynolds's smile tightened. "Justice, an interesting choice of words." He glanced pointedly at the banking commissioner's office. "I assume your business involves certain allegations against Harrison Mills." The question confirmed what Abigail had immediately suspected. Reynolds's presence was no coincidence. He had either followed them from Silverwood or been sent ahead by Mills to intercept them. "Our business is our own," Nathaniel said, stepping slightly forward. "If you'll excuse us." "Of course." Reynolds made no move to depart, however. "Though I feel obligated to mention that Commissioner Holloway left for Butte early this morning. Mining concerns requiring his personal attention, I understand. He won't return until next week at earliest." Abigail felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. "You seem remarkably well informed about the commissioner's schedule." "Helena is a small city in its way. News travels." Reynolds adjusted his gloves with deliberate precision. "Almost as quickly as it travels in Silverwood. For instance, I heard this morning that your ranch hands are quite concerned about your abrupt departure with Mr. Sullivan. Some might even characterize it as an elopement." "That's absurd," Abigail snapped, though she felt a flush rising in her cheeks. "Is it a widow of means facing financial ruin suddenly vanishes with a scarred ranch hand of mysterious background?" Reynolds shrugged elegantly. "The story practically writes itself, especially after your very public association with the Sullivan witch." Nathaniel's hands clenched at his sides. "You've delivered your message, Reynolds. Now I suggest you leave before I forget I'm in the presence of a lady." Reynolds's eyes narrowed, but he took a step back. "Just sharing observations, Sullivan, as a concerned friend of the community." He turned to Abigail, his expression softening to something that might have passed for sympathy had she not already seen the malice beneath. "Mrs. Blackwood, if you should reconsider your associations, my offer remains open. A respectable marriage could still salvage your reputation, if not your ranch. I'd rather lose everything I own than gain a husband who values appearances above truth." Abigail replied, the words coming easily now that she recognized their fundamental truth. "Good day, Dr. Reynolds." Taking Nathaniel's arm, a deliberate gesture that made Reynolds' mouth tighten further, she walked past the doctor and up the steps of the commissioner's office, her back straight, despite the crushing disappointment of learning Holloway was absent. Inside, a clerk confirmed Reynolds' information. "Commissioner Holloway left at first light for Butte," the young man said apologetically. "Urgent matters with the copper interests there. He's not expected back until Tuesday next." "This can't wait until Tuesday," Abigail said, desperation edging her voice. "We have evidence of serious financial improprieties at Silverwood Bank that require immediate attention." The clerk looked uncomfortable. "I'm afraid I'm not authorized to receive such evidence or take action in the commissioner's absence." "Is there anyone in Helena who is?" Nathaniel asked. "A deputy commissioner, perhaps. Mr. Holloway's assistant. Mr. Farnsworth occasionally acts in his stead for routine matters," the clerk admitted reluctantly. "But he's quite particular about which issues he's willing to address without the commissioner's direct approval." "Where might we find Mr. Farnsworth?" Abigail pressed. "He keeps offices at the First Bank of Helena, where he serves as chief accountant when not assisting the commissioner." The clerk hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "But I should mention that Mr. Farnsworth and Harrison Mills were classmates at Yale. They maintain cordial relations." This final blow nearly crushed Abigail's remaining hope. Mills had outmaneuvered them completely, ensuring the commissioner's absence and leaving only his own associate to receive their complaints. "Thank you for your candor," Nathaniel told the clerk, placing a steadying hand at Abigail's elbow as he guided her back outside. On the street safely beyond Reynolds's hearing, the doctor having departed with evident satisfaction, Abigail finally allowed her composure to crack. "It was all for nothing," she said, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. "Mills knew we were coming. He arranged everything, the commissioner's convenient absence, Reynolds's presence, to witness our arrival, even ensuring his Yale classmate would be the only official available to hear our case." "Not for nothing," Nathaniel replied firmly. "We know now the extent of Mills' influence and the lengths he'll go to protect himself. That knowledge has value." "What value?" "The auction is in 2 days. We can't possibly return to Whispering Pines in time, even if we left this minute and rode through the night." Abigail fought against the despair threatening to overwhelm her. "Everything my parents built will be sold to the highest bidder, probably Northern Pacific, who will strip mine the silver from the North Ridge and lay tracks through what remains." Nathaniel led her to a small bench outside a nearby cafe, encouraging her to sit. "We're not defeated yet," he said, his voice low and steady. "There are still options we haven't explored." "What options?" "The commissioner is gone. The sheriff is intimidated. The bank holds the debt." Abigail shook her head. "Unless you can produce $3,000 by Saturday noon, Whispering Pines is lost." "Perhaps not $3,000, Nathaniel said thoughtfully. "But what about proof of the silver deposit's value, enough to convince a judge that Mills is foreclosing on property worth far more than the debt owed? What judge would hear such a case in time? And what proof could we possibly obtain? The Territorial Assay Office is here in Helena. With our samples from the spring, they could provide an official valuation of the silver content." Nathaniel's scarred face took on new animation as the plan formed. "And Judge Harlow of the Third Circuit is known for his dislike of banking interests. He holds court here on Thursdays tomorrow." Hope flickered again in Abigail's chest, but caution tempered it. Even if the assay office confirms the silver's value, and even if Judge Harlow would hear our case, would it be enough to stop the auction? A judicial injunction would prevent the sale until the matter of the property's true value could be properly established, Nathaniel explained. It wouldn't solve the debt permanently, but it would buy time, perhaps enough to arrange proper financing based on the silver deposit's potential. Abigail considered this new path. It was a slim chance, fraught with obstacles, and dependent on multiple factors aligning in their favor. But it was a chance, nonetheless, more than she had moments ago. "The assay office first, then," she decided, rising from the bench with renewed purpose. "We have samples to present." The Territorial Assay Office was a surprisingly modern facility, its interior filled with the latest scientific equipment for analyzing mineral content. The assayer, a German immigrant named Schmidt, with wire-rimmed spectacles and meticulous hands, examined their samples with professional thoroughness. "Interesting specimens," he muttered, peering through a magnifying lens at the rock Nathaniel had collected from the spring's edge. "Silver content is present, yes, but also unusual mineral combinations. Where did you say these came from?" "A spring on private property," Abigail replied carefully. We are hoping to determine if the deposit has commercial value. Schmidt adjusted his spectacles. For full assessment, I would need larger samples, preferably core samples from proper drilling. But even from these, he performed several chemical tests, making notes in a precise hand. I can tell you the silver content is significant. Not the richest I have seen, but consistent with profitable operations elsewhere in the territory. Could you provide an estimate of potential value? Nathaniel asked. For a deposit of this type on, say, 5 acres of land, the assayer considered. Without more extensive sampling, any estimate would be speculative. But based on similar formations I've documented, he performed some quick calculations on a sheet of paper. A conservative valuation might be $15,000 to $20,000, potentially much more, depending on the depth and consistency of the vein. Abigail felt a surge of vindication. The silver deposit was real and valuable, far more valuable than the $3,000 Mills sought to claim through foreclosure. We need official documentation of your findings, she said. For a court hearing. Schmidt nodded, already preparing the necessary forms. The Territorial Assay Office is required to provide certification of all legitimate mineral evaluations, though I must note the preliminary nature of this assessment. By mid-afternoon, they had their documentation official papers bearing the territorial seal, confirming the presence of commercially viable silver deposits in their samples. It wasn't definitive proof of Whispering Pines' hidden wealth, but it was enough to raise serious questions about the fairness of Mills' foreclosure. Judge Harlow begins court at 9 tomorrow morning, Nathaniel said as they left the assay office. We should prepare our case carefully tonight. He's known for his impatience with unprepared petitioners. Then we need a quiet place to work, Abigail replied. Somewhere Mills' friends won't find us. Nathaniel considered for a moment. I know a place. An old patient keeps rooms above his bookshop that he sometimes rents to travelers seeking privacy. His discretion is absolute. The bookshop occupied a narrow building on a side street away from Helena's main thoroughfare. Its proprietor, a soft-spoken man named Chen, with a slight limp and intelligent eyes, greeted Nathaniel with evident pleasure. "Dr. Sullivan," he said, bowing slightly, "it has been too long." "Mr. Chen," Nathaniel returned the gesture with equal respect. "You're looking well. Thanks to your skill with a broken leg that others would have amputated." Chen turned to Abigail with a welcoming smile. "And this is Mrs. Abigail Blackwood." Nathaniel introduced her. "A friend in need of quiet accommodations for the night. We have legal matters to prepare." Chen nodded, asking no further questions. "The upstairs rooms are available. 2 chambers with a shared sitting area. Will that be suitable?" The arrangement was proper enough to preserve what remained of Abigail's reputation while giving them the space they needed to work. Chen led them up a narrow staircase at the back of the shop to a cozy apartment furnished with simple but well-crafted pieces. "I will bring tea," he said, departing with another slight bow. Alone in the sitting room, Abigail and Nathaniel spread their documents across a small table. Oliver's papers from the strong box, the assayer's certification notes they had made about the bank's suspicious activities. Together, they crafted their petition to Judge Harlow, arguing that the foreclosure should be delayed, pending full investigation of both the property's true value and the circumstances surrounding Oliver Blackwood's debts. Chen brought not only tea, but a substantial meal of fragrant rice, vegetables, and tender beef, prepared in a style Abigail had never encountered. He served it without comment on their work-strewn table, then disappeared back to his shop below. "He seems to hold you in high regard," Abigail observed as they ate. Nathaniel nodded. During the mining boom of '76, Chen was caught in a tunnel collapse. The company doctor took one look at his crushed leg and prepared to amputate. "Chen's cousin brought me from another camp for a second opinion." And you saved his leg. I did what any competent surgeon would do, Nathaniel corrected, though his expression softened with the memory. The damage was severe, but repairable with proper technique. The mining company wasn't pleased. They preferred quick amputations that got men out of their responsibility sooner. Yet, you insisted on proper treatment. It was the right thing to do. He shrugged slightly as if the matter required no further explanation. Abigail studied him across the table, seeing again the healer beneath the ranch hand's exterior. "You miss it," she said softly. "Not just medicine in the abstract, but the actual work of healing, of making a difference." Nathaniel was silent for a long moment. "Sometimes," he finally admitted, "when I see someone suffering who might be helped with knowledge I possess. But then I remember the limitations of these hands," when he glanced down at his scarred right hand, "and the dangers of a physician who thinks too highly of his own abilities. Your abilities saved Mr. Chen's livelihood, as they've saved countless others, I imagine." Abigail leaned forward, her expression earnest. "Nathaniel, the world has enough ranch hands. It has precious few healers with both skill and humility." He met her gaze, something vulnerable flickering in his eyes. "What are you suggesting? That after we save Whispering Pines, and we will save it, you consider returning to medicine? Perhaps not surgery, if your hands truly won't allow it. But there are many ways to heal. You sound very certain of our success tomorrow," he observed, gently deflecting the deeper discussion. "Judge Harlow is notoriously unpredictable." Abigail allowed the change of subject, recognizing that some transformations required time and gentle persistence. "Then we must be thoroughly prepared. Let's continue." They worked late into the evening, refining their arguments, organizing their evidence, anticipating potential objections. As the night deepened, fatigue began to take its toll, Abigail's eyes growing heavy, despite her determination. "You should rest," Nathaniel said, noticing her stifled yawn. "Tomorrow will demand all our mental clarity." Abigail nodded reluctantly. "Wake me at first light. I want to review everything once more before court." "Of course." They parted to their separate chambers, the propriety of their arrangement preserved even as the depth of their partnership in this venture continued to grow. In her small but comfortable room, Abigail removed her traveling clothes and slipped into the nightdress she had packed for their journey. Sitting on the edge of the bed, she found herself touching the silver pendant Ruth Sullivan had given her, her mother's talisman cool against her skin. "Give me strength," she whispered, unsure if she addressed her mother Ruth or some higher power. "For tomorrow and for whatever follows." Sleep came swiftly, bearing dreams of silver waters flowing over Whispering Pines, nurturing everything they touched. The territorial courthouse stood imposing against the morning sky, its stone facade suggesting permanence and authority in a land still forming its institutions. Inside the main courtroom bustled with the day's business lawyers, conferring in hushed tones, clerks organizing dockets, petitioners waiting nervously on hard wooden benches. Abigail and Nathaniel had arrived early, dressed in their cleanest traveling clothes, their petition and supporting documents organized in Abigail's leather satchel. They sat side by side on a bench near the front, watching as various cases were called, heard, and dispatched with varying degrees of judicial patience. Judge Harlow himself matched his courthouse in presence, a substantial man with iron-gray hair and piercing eyes that seemed to evaluate each person standing before him with immediate and unyielding assessment. His judgments came swiftly, his reasoning clear, if sometimes brusque. He showed equal impatience with legal maneuvering and emotional appeals, preferring straightforward facts presented without embellishment. "Docket number 27, the court clerk announced after the conclusion of a boundary dispute. "Petition for injunctive relief, Abigail Blackwood, versus Silverwood Bank and Harrison Mills. As Abigail rose, her heart pounding, the courtroom doors opened. Dr. Samuel Reynolds entered, accompanied by a distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit who could only be Frederick Farnsworth, the commissioner's assistant. They took seats at the back, Reynolds offering Abigail a small, knowing smile. "Mrs. Blackwood," Judge Harlow intoned, reviewing the petition before him, "you're seeking to prevent a lawful foreclosure on the property known as Whispering Pines Ranch, claiming," he peered over his spectacles, "improper banking practices and failure to consider the property's full value. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor." Abigail stepped forward, willing her voice to remain steady. "We have evidence that Silverwood Bank, under Harrison Mills's direction, is attempting to foreclose on property worth significantly more than the debt owed while concealing the improper origins of that debt." Harlow's bushy eyebrows rose slightly. "Serious allegations, Mrs. Blackwood. Do you have representation?" "I represent myself, Your Honor, with assistance from Mr. Nathaniel Sullivan, who has knowledge pertinent to the case." The judge glanced at Nathaniel, noting his scarred visage, without comment. "Very well. Present your evidence." With careful precision, Abigail laid out their case. Oliver's embezzlement from the bank, Mill's knowledge of his son's activities, the rushed foreclosure on Whispering Pines, and finally the silver deposit, confirmed by the Territorial Assay Office. The property Harrison Mills seeks to claim for $3,000 contains mineral wealth conservatively valued at $15,000 to $20,000, she concluded, presenting the assayer's certification. "This constitutes a gross inequity that the court should not permit, especially given the questionable circumstances surrounding the debt itself." Judge Harlow examined the assayer's report with careful attention, then returned to the financial documents from Oliver's strongbox. His expression remained impassive, but he asked several pointed questions that suggested he was taking the matter seriously. "These bank records," he said, holding up Oliver's papers, "how can you verify their authenticity? They could be forgeries created to avoid a legitimate debt." "The documents were recovered from a strongbox in my husband's possession at the time of his death," Abigail explained. "Sheriff Taylor of Silverwood can confirm this, though he is not present today." "And these letters between Oliver Blackwood and his father," Harlow continued, "discussing covering up losses these two were in the strongbox." "Yes, Your Honor. The entire correspondence was preserved." The judge frowned, tapping the papers against his desk. "Concerning, if genuine, but still insufficient to halt a lawful foreclosure without testimony from the parties involved." He turned his attention to the assayer's report. "This mineral valuation, however, raises different questions. Mr. Schmidt is well respected in his field." From the back of the courtroom came the sound of a throat being cleared. Frederick Farnsworth rose, his tailored suit and gold watch chain, marking him as a man of financial means. "Your Honor, if I may address the court on this matter." Judge Harlow's frown deepened. "You are Frederick Farnsworth, Assistant to Banking Commissioner Holloway and Chief Accountant at First Bank of Helena." Farnsworth moved forward with practiced confidence. "I feel obligated to provide context regarding Mrs. Blackwood's allegations." "This is highly irregular, Mr. Farnsworth. You are not a party to this case. As the Commissioner's representative in his absence, I have a duty to address claims of banking impropriety that might affect territorial financial stability," Farnsworth countered smoothly. "May I speak briefly?" Judge Harlow considered, then nodded curtly. "Briefly, Mr. Farnsworth. This is not a full hearing, merely a petition for injunctive relief." "Of course, Your Honor." Farnsworth turned slightly to include both the judge and Abigail in his address. "The Banking Commission is aware of Mrs. Blackwood's concerns about Silverwood Bank." However, a preliminary review of the situation suggests this is simply a case of a widow facing unfortunate financial realities and seeking to avoid paying legitimate debts. That's not true, Abigail interjected, her composure slipping. The documents could easily have been created after the fact. Farnsworth continued seamlessly. As for the mineral report, speculative mining valuations are notoriously unreliable. Many promising samples prove worthless when fully explored. Judge Harlow's expression had grown increasingly skeptical. Mrs. Blackwood, how do you respond to Mr. Farnsworth's characterization? Abigail felt the case slipping away. Farnsworth's practiced legal manner and position of authority were swaying the judge against them. She glanced at Nathaniel, who nodded encouragingly, and gathered her determination. Your Honor, Mr. Farnsworth neglected to mention his personal connection to Harrison Mills. They were classmates at Yale and maintained close relations, hardly the impartial assessment he implies. Farnsworth's confident expression faltered slightly. Furthermore, Abigail continued, if the Banking Commission has conducted a preliminary review, as he claims, why was Commissioner Holloway suddenly called to Butte yesterday, making himself unavailable to hear our evidence directly? And why was Dr. Reynolds, a known associate of Harrison Mills, waiting to observe our arrival at the Commissioner's office? Judge Harlow's gaze sharpened. Is this true, Mr. Farnsworth? Do you have a personal relationship with Mr. Mills that might color your assessment? We are acquainted, Your Honor, as are many men of business in the territory, but that hardly suggests impartiality, Harlow finished for him. Nor does the convenient absence of Commissioner Holloway at precisely the moment when serious allegations against a fellow banker required investigation. For the first time, Farnsworth looked genuinely uncomfortable. The timing is coincidental, I assure you. Mining interests in Butte can wait, the judge interrupted firmly. Banking integrity cannot. He turned back to Abigail. Mrs. Blackwood, while I cannot verify the authenticity of your financial documents without testimony from the parties involved, the assayer's report, and the suspicious circumstances surrounding the Banking Commission's response, give me pause. Hope flickered in Abigail's chest. Then you'll grant the injunction. A temporary stay only, Harlow clarified, pending full investigation by Commissioner Holloway upon his return. The foreclosure auction will be postponed for 30 days, during which time a proper evaluation of both the mineral deposits and the banking practices in question must be conducted. Relief washed over Abigail with such force that she nearly swayed on her feet. Nathaniel stepped forward, providing silent support with his presence beside her. Thank you, Your Honor, she managed. Don't thank me yet, Mrs. Blackwood. This stay merely buys time for proper investigation. If your allegations prove unfounded, the foreclosure will proceed as planned. Harlow turned to his clerk. Prepare the necessary papers. Court is adjourned for 1 hour. As the judge departed, Farnsworth approached Abigail, his expression tightly controlled. An impressive performance, Mrs. Blackwood, but ultimately futile. 30 days will change nothing except to increase the interest on your debt. Perhaps, Abigail replied calmly, or perhaps it will allow time for the full truth to emerge. About Oliver's embezzlement, about Harrison Mills's cover-up, about your own role in obstructing justice. Farnsworth's facade cracked slightly, anger flashing in his eyes. Be careful, madam. Accusations of that nature can have serious consequences. So can fraud, Nathaniel interjected quietly. And conspiracy. Both federal crimes, I believe. Without another word, Farnsworth turned and departed. Reynolds following close behind after casting a final venomous glance in their direction. Alone in the courtroom, save for the clerk preparing their injunction papers Abigail finally allowed herself a moment of genuine emotion. "We did it," she whispered. 30 days. 30 days, Nathaniel agreed, the hint of a smile warming his scarred features. Time enough to ensure a full investigation, time enough for the truth to come to light. Time enough to save Whispering Pines. Abigail impulsively reached for his hand, squeezing it in gratitude. "I couldn't have done this without you, Nathaniel." His fingers curled around hers briefly before propriety reasserted itself and they stepped apart. "You would have found a way, Abigail Harrington. You're stronger than you know." The simple affirmation spoken with such quiet certainty touched her more deeply than elaborate praise could have. In that moment, standing in the territorial courthouse with the first real victory secured, Abigail realized something that had been growing steadily clearer throughout their journey. She was falling in love with Nathaniel Sullivan, not with gratitude or relief or the desperate need for alliance, but with genuine, clear-eyed appreciation for the man himself, his integrity, his intelligence, his gentle strength, the scarred doctor who had helped her find her own courage again. The realization should have frightened her. Instead, it filled her with a calm certainty, like coming home after a long journey. Whatever came next, whatever challenges the 30 days might bring, she would face them not just for Whispering Pines, but for the future that now seemed possible beyond it. A future where silver waters flowed healing what had been broken, nurturing what could yet grow. The journey back to Whispering Pines held none of the tension of their departure. With the judge's injunction safely in Abigail's satchel, they rode at a more measured pace, arriving at the ranch late on Friday afternoon, a full day before the now postponed auction had been scheduled to occur. Word of their success had somehow preceded them. As they approached the ranch house, ranch hands emerged from the barn and bunkhouse, gathering in the yard, with expressions ranging from curiosity to open relief. Leonidas stood on the porch, his weathered face breaking into a rare smile as he spotted them. "Miss Abigail, Mr. Sullivan." He hurried down the steps to take their horses. "We got the telegram this morning. Judge Harlow's injunction against the auction. The whole valley's talking about it." "Telegram?" Abigail asked, surprised. "We sent no telegram. Came from Helena, signed by the court clerk," Leonidas explained. "Said the auction's postponed 30 days pending investigation of the bank." "Is it true?" "It's true," Nathaniel confirmed as he helped Abigail dismount. "Judge Harlow was persuaded by our evidence despite interference from Mills's associates." The gathered ranch hands broke into spontaneous cheers, several tossing their hats in celebration. Mrs. Finch appeared at the door, wiping her hands on her apron, her usually stern face softened with relief. "Thank the Lord," she said as Abigail approached the porch. "I've been baking since the news came, thought a celebration might be in order." Abigail was touched by their enthusiasm. These people who had worked Whispering Pines land for years, who had witnessed her marriage to Oliver and her subsequent withdrawal into herself, who had seen her begin to emerge again in recent days. "A celebration is indeed in order," she agreed warmly. "Please tell me you made your apple pie, Mrs. Finch." "3 of them," the housekeeper confirmed with quiet pride, "and a ham glazed with maple. Figured you'd be hungry after your journey." As the ranch hands dispersed to finish evening chores before the promised feast, Abigail turned to Nathaniel. "Will you join us? You've earned a place of honor at the table." Something like regret crossed his scarred features. "I should check on my grandmother first. After the confrontation with Pastor Wilson, I'm concerned about her safety." "Of course. Please tell her she's welcome here as well." In fact, Abigail hesitated, then committed to the invitation. "Please tell her I'd be honored if she would make Whispering Pines her home, at least until things settle in town." The East Wing has rooms that have stood empty too long. Nathaniel's expression softened with surprise and gratitude. That's a generous offer given the town's attitude toward her, toward both of us. The town's attitude is changing, Abigail replied with quiet confidence. And even if it weren't, some things matter more than public opinion. Friendship, loyalty, truth. She met his gaze directly. You and Ruth stood by me when it mattered most. Whispering Pines will always welcome you both. For a moment, something deeper than friendship flickered between them, unspoken but undeniable. Then Nathaniel nodded, touching the brim of his hat in that now familiar gesture of respect. We'll return before sundown, he promised. Save some of Mrs. Finch's apple pie. As he rode toward town, Abigail watched until he disappeared from view, a sense of completion settling over her that had nothing to do with the legal victory they had achieved. Something had changed during their journey to Helena, or perhaps it had been changing gradually all along, and she had only now recognized it fully. The ranch house welcomed her with familiar scents and sounds, yet somehow it felt different, lighter, more alive with possibility than it had in years. Moving through rooms that had witnessed both her parents' happiness and her own marital misery, Abigail felt as if she were reclaiming not just Whispering Pines, but herself. In her bedroom, she changed from her traveling clothes into a simple blue dress her mother had sewn years ago, one Oliver had dismissed as too plain for his wife, but which had always been among her favorites. The fabric was soft with age, and many washings the color still rich against her skin. At her dressing table, she unpinned her hair, letting it fall loose around her shoulders. The face in the mirror looked back at her with clear eyes and renewed purpose, not quite the carefree girl she had been before marriage, but not the diminished ghost of Oliver's wife either. Someone new yet familiar, someone stronger. A light tap at her door announced Mrs. Finch, bearing a tray with tea and fresh biscuits. "Thought you might need refreshment before the celebration," the housekeeper said, setting the tray on a small table by the window. "It's good to have you home, Miss Abigail." The use of her maiden title didn't escape Abigail's notice. "Thank you, Mrs. Finch. It's good to be home." The older woman hesitated, then spoke with uncharacteristic directness. "If you don't mind my saying so, you look more like yourself than you have in years. Like Elizabeth's daughter again." The simple observation touched Abigail deeply. "I feel more like myself," she admitted. "As if I've remembered who I truly am." Mrs. Finch nodded in satisfaction. "Your mother would be proud. She always said you had her stubbornness and your father's heart, a combination that would serve you well and when life grew difficult. She said that I don't remember. You were young when she told me, just 16, facing your first real heartbreak when that Miller boy chose another girl for the harvest dance." Mrs. Finch's usually stern face softened with the memory. "Elizabeth said, 'My Abigail hurts deeply because she loves deeply, but she'll heal stronger for it.'" Tears pricked at Abigail's eyes, not of sorrow, but of recognition. Her mother had known her so well, had seen the woman she would become even then. "Thank you for telling me that," she said softly. Mrs. Finch nodded, returning to her customary brisk manner. "Best drink your tea while it's hot. The celebration will begin soon, and from the looks of it, half the valley's coming." After the housekeeper departed, Abigail moved to the window that overlooked the ranch yard. Sure enough, wagons were beginning to arrive, neighboring ranchers and farmers' townspeople from Silverwood families she recognized as longtime friends of her parents. Word of the injunction had spread quickly, bringing people to Whispering Pines who hadn't visited in years. Some out of genuine support, others perhaps out of curiosity about how the widow Blackwood had managed to outmaneuver Harrison Mills even temporarily. Among the arriving wagons, she spotted Ruth Sullivan's small buggy driven by Nathaniel. The sight of them together, grandmother and grandson both outsiders in Silverwood, yet essential to saving Whispering Pines, filled Abigail with a fierce protectiveness. Whatever the future held, these two would have a place in it. She would make certain of that. By the time Abigail descended to join the gathering, the celebration was in full swing. Tables had been set up in the yard laden with food, contributed by visitors and prepared by Mrs. Finch. Lanterns hung from tree branches, ready to illuminate the festivities as evening approached. Someone had brought a fiddle and was playing lively tunes that had several couples dancing on a cleared patch of ground. Leonidas appeared at her side, offering a glass of cider. "Quite a turnout, Miss Abigail. Haven't seen Whispering Pines this lively since your parents' 20th anniversary celebration." "It's wonderful," Abigail agreed, accepting the cider gratefully. "Though I confess I'm surprised by how many people have come. Folks have been waiting for someone to stand up to Harrison Mills for years," Leonidas explained. "You gave them courage by example." Before she could respond, Mrs. Cooper, the blacksmith's wife, approached with a basket of fresh bread. "Mrs. Blackwood, or should I say Miss Harrington, now everyone's talking about how you've reclaimed your family name." Abigail hadn't actually announced such a decision, though she had been considering it privately. "Word travels fast in Silverwood Valley," she observed with a small smile. "Like wildfire, Mrs." Cooper agreed cheerfully. "Just like the news that you discovered silver on Whispering Pines land. Is it true? Are you to be a mining heiress now?" Clearly the details of their court case had spread with varying degrees of accuracy. "The silver deposit is real," Abigail confirmed carefully, though its full extent remains to be determined. "But Whispering Pines will always be a working ranch, first and foremost." This seemed to satisfy Mrs. Cooper, who moved on to share her bread and gossip with other guests. As the evening progressed, Abigail made her way through the celebration, accepting congratulations and well wishes from people who had barely acknowledged her during her marriage to Oliver. She spotted Ruth Sullivan seated comfortably near one of the fire pits, surrounded by a group of women who seemed to be consulting her about various ailments and remedies. The sight warmed Abigail's heart. Ruth accepted in a way that would have been unthinkable just days ago. Nathaniel stood slightly apart from the main gathering, observing, rather than participating. Even in the festive atmosphere, he maintained a certain reserve, his scarred face partially shadowed by his hat. Yet he seemed content, a slight smile visible when he thought no one was watching. Abigail made her way to his side. "You brought quite a few people with you from town," she observed, nodding toward several wagons that had arrived with Ruth's buggy. "Word spread that Ruth Sullivan was invited to Whispering Pines," he explained. "Some were curious. Others genuinely wanted to show support. And Pastor Wilson, has he abandoned his crusade?" Nathaniel's expression grew more serious. "For now, the failed arrest attempt and your public support of Grandma Ruth have made him reconsider his approach, but men like Wilson don't change their beliefs easily." "No," Abigail agreed. "Nor do men like Harrison Mills simply accept defeat. The 30 days ahead won't be easy." "But you won't face them alone." The simple statement carried weight beyond its words. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the celebration around them seemed to fade into the background. Something passed between them, understanding, acknowledgement of feelings that had grown steadily throughout their shared journey. "Nathaniel, Abigail." The moment was broken by the arrival of Isaiah Matthews, the widowed leather merchant who had been among her persistent suitors. "What a wonderful celebration, and what remarkable news about your victory in Helena." Unlike Dr. Reynolds, Matthews had always been genuinely kind if misguided in his persistent courtship. Abigail managed a polite smile. Thank you, Mr. Matthews. It's only a temporary victory, but an important one. Temporary, but significant, Matthews agreed amiably. He glanced at Nathaniel, acknowledging him with a respectful nod. Mr. Sullivan, I understand you accompanied Mrs. Blackwood to Helena. A fortunate choice of traveling companion, it seems. Mr. Sullivan's knowledge was instrumental in our case, Abigail replied, subtly emphasizing Nathaniel's contribution. Both his medical training and his understanding of mining matters proved invaluable. Matthew's eyebrows rose slightly. Medical training, I wasn't aware. Harvard Medical School, Nathaniel said quietly. Before the war. Indeed, Matthews seemed genuinely impressed, rather than skeptical. Silverwood could certainly use another physician. Dr. Reynolds is often unavailable when most needed. The conversation shifted to medical matters, with Matthews revealing surprising knowledge based on his experience caring for his late wife during her illness. Throughout, he treated Nathaniel with the same respect he showed Abigail, seemingly untroubled by the other man's scarred appearance or lower social standing. When Matthews departed to check on his children, who had joined the younger ranch hands in a game of tag, Nathaniel turned to Abigail with mild surprise. He's actually decent, he observed, unlike Reynolds. Isaiah Matthews is a good man, Abigail agreed. Just not the right man for me. The words emerged with quiet certainty, her gaze meeting Nathaniel's with clear meaning. Before he could respond, a commotion at the edge of the celebration drew their attention. A carriage had arrived, an expensive one with polished brass fittings and matching black horses. Harrison Mills stepped down impeccably dressed, despite the informal nature of the gathering. Behind him came Frederick Farnsworth, looking decidedly uncomfortable. The festive atmosphere cooled noticeably as Mills made his way through the crowd, acknowledging greetings with curt nods, but focused on reaching Abigail. Nathaniel moved subtly closer to her side, protective without being possessive. "Mrs. Blackwood," Mills said when he reached them, his tone carefully modulated to carry just far enough for nearby guests to hear. Quite a celebration for what is merely a postponement of the inevitable. "Mr. Mills," Abigail replied with equal control, "I didn't expect you to join us this evening. I thought a personal visit appropriate given recent developments." His gaze shifted briefly to Nathaniel, dismissive and cold, before returning to Abigail. "Perhaps we could speak privately." "Anything you wish to say can be said here," Abigail responded firmly. "Mr. Sullivan and I have no secrets regarding Whispering Pines' situation." Mills's mouth tightened at this deliberate inclusion of Nathaniel in their business. "Very well. I've come to offer a final opportunity to resolve this matter without further unpleasantness." "I'm listening." "The bank will forgive the entire debt," Mills stated, "in exchange for mineral rights to the North Ridge. 5 acres only, leaving the remainder of Whispering Pines intact and under your ownership." The offer was unexpectedly generous on the surface, but Abigail had learned much these past days about looking beneath surface appearances. "And the documents implicating your son in embezzlement?" she asked quietly. "What becomes of those?" Mills's expression hardened. "Part of our agreement would include the return of all personal papers belonging to my late son. Family matters should remain private, don't you agree?" "Some matters, perhaps. Criminal activities affecting public trust in financial institutions, those seem decidedly public concerns." "Be careful, Mrs. Blackwood," Mills cautioned, his voice dropping further. "Your temporary injunction provides limited protection. Accidents happen. Witnesses reconsider their testimony. Judges revise their opinions." The threat, though veiled, was unmistakable. Beside her, Nathaniel tensed, but Abigail placed a gentle hand on his arm, steadying him as he had so often steadied her. "Mr. Mills, she said, her voice carrying clearly enough that several nearby conversations paused. Let me be equally direct. The North Ridge is not for sale or trade, not to the railroad, not to mining interests, and certainly not to Silverwood Bank. You're making a serious mistake, Mills warned. 30 days will pass quickly, and then what, you'll have no defense against foreclosure. On the contrary, came a new voice, firm and authoritative. Frederick Farnsworth stepped forward, his expression resigned but determined. Harrison, this has gone far enough. I've examined the documents Mrs. Blackwood presented in court. They're genuine, and they implicate not just Oliver, but potentially you as well. Mills stared at his friend in shocked betrayal. Fred, what are you? Doing my duty as assistant banking commissioner, Farnsworth interrupted. The commissioner returns from Butte tomorrow. I've already telegraphed him the basic facts. He's bringing a federal banking examiner with him. The color drained from Mills's face. You had no right. I had every right and responsibility, Farnsworth corrected firmly. You're my friend Harrison, which is why I came tonight to urge you to cooperate fully with the investigation. It's your only chance to salvage anything from this situation. For a moment, Mills seemed genuinely at a loss, a man watching his carefully constructed world crumble around him. Then his expression hardened into cold fury. This isn't over, he said to Abigail, voice tight with suppressed rage. Not by a long measure. Without another word, he turned and strode back to his carriage, his rigid posture betraying the effort it took to maintain his dignity before the watching crowd. Farnsworth remained looking somewhat embarrassed. Mrs. Blackwood, I owe you an apology. My friendship with Harrison clouded my professional judgment initially, but after reviewing the evidence more thoroughly, he shook his head. The Banking Commission will conduct a complete investigation. In the meantime, any foreclosure proceedings against Whispering Pines are suspended indefinitely. Thank you, Mr. Farnsworth, Abigail said, genuinely appreciating his belated integrity. It couldn't have been easy to stand against an old friend. Harder still, to stand against one's own conscience, he replied simply. With a respectful nod to both her and Nathaniel, he followed after Mills, though at a more measured pace. As the carriage departed, the celebration gradually resumed its festive atmosphere, though now with an added element of genuine victory. The story of Mills's confrontation and Farnsworth's surprising reversal spread quickly through the gathering, growing more dramatic with each retelling. It seems our 30 days may extend indefinitely, Nathaniel observed quietly. Yes, Abigail agreed, though I suspect Harrison Mills will fight to the bitter end. And the silver deposit? What will you do about that now? It was the question Abigail had been considering since their discovery at the spring. The silver was real valuable, potentially the solution to all Whispering Pines' financial challenges. Yet its extraction would forever change the sacred place her father had promised to protect. I don't know yet, she admitted, but I think I need to visit the North Ridge again, to sit by the spring and listen for guidance as my mother did. Would you like company for that journey? Nathaniel asked, his scarred face illuminated by firelight, his expression open and gentle. Abigail smiled, something warm unfurling in her chest. Yes, she said simply. I would like that very much. Around them, the celebration continued, music and laughter, food and fellowship. The community of Silverwood Valley coming together as they had in her parents' time. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, the commissioner's investigation decisions about the silver deposit, the ongoing transformation of Whispering Pines under her renewed stewardship. But tonight, standing beside the scarred doctor who had helped her rediscover her own strength, Abigail Harrington felt something she had nearly forgotten existed. Peace. Possibility. and the quiet certainty that some springs never run dry, even in the harshest drought. Dawn bathed the north ridge in golden light as Abigail and Nathaniel reached the clearing above the spring. They had ridden out from Whispering Pines as the first light touched the eastern sky, leaving behind a ranch still sleeping after the previous night's celebration. The morning air was cool and sweet with pine resin, the world hushed except for birdsong and the gentle rustle of wind through needled branches. They dismounted at the edge of the clearing, leaving their horses ground-tied while they approached the spring on foot. The water bubbled from the rock face as it had for centuries, forming its small pool before continuing downslope as a slender stream. Around it grew the herbs with tiny purple flowers that Ruth had identified as having healing properties, their fragrance sharp and clean in the morning air. Abigail knelt beside the pool, touching her mother's silver pendant that hung around her neck. The cool weight of it against her skin had become a comfort, a connection to the woman who had found strength here before her. "It's beautiful," Nathaniel said quietly, standing a respectful distance behind her. "I understand why the Blackfoot considered it sacred." "My father promised them it would remain untouched," Abigail replied, watching sunlight dance on the water's surface. "That's what I've been struggling with most, not just the practical question of mining versus ranching, but the moral question of breaking his word." Nathaniel moved closer, settling beside her at the pool's edge. "What would your father value more, keeping a specific promise or preserving the larger legacy he built for you?" It was the heart of the matter, asked with simple clarity that cut through Abigail's tangled thoughts. "He valued integrity above all else," she said slowly, "but also adaptability. He used to say that rigidity breaks while flexibility bends." A wise perspective. "Yes." Abigail dipped her fingers into the spring water, watching ripples spread across the surface. "Perhaps there's a middle path, one that honors the spirit of his promise while acknowledging changed circumstances." What might that look like? She considered the ideas forming as she spoke them aloud. Limited extraction, perhaps. Not a full mining operation that would destroy the spring, but careful work that preserves its flow. And a portion of any profits dedicated to the Blackfoot people, a trust to support their welfare and preserve their cultural knowledge. Nathaniel nodded thoughtfully. "A compromise that respects both the letter and the spirit of your father's word." "And what about you?" Abigail asked, turning to face him fully. "Have you considered what we discussed yesterday, about returning to medicine?" The question clearly caught him off guard. For a moment, he was silent, his scarred face thoughtful in the morning light. "I've thought of little else," he finally admitted. "But the barriers remain. These hands," he held them up, the right one, bearing its network of healed burn tissue, "still lack the precision required for surgery. And my appearance—" "Your appearance matters far less than your knowledge," Abigail interrupted gently. "Silverwood has no doctor other than Reynolds, who cares more for social standing than healing. The surrounding ranches and smaller settlements have none at all." "A country doctor," Nathaniel mused, considering the possibility. "No delicate surgeries, but setting bones, delivering babies, treating illnesses. Teaching others, perhaps? Sharing your Harvard education with those who would never have access to such knowledge otherwise." Abigail's voice grew more animated as the vision took shape. "Ruth could work alongside you, her herbal remedies complementing your medical training. A true healing center for the valley." Something like hope flickered in Nathaniel's eyes, tentative but genuine. "It would require space, equipment, supplies." "Whispering Pines has space in abundance," Abigail said without hesitation. "The East Wing has stood empty for years. With some modifications, it could serve admirably as a clinic." Nathaniel studied her face as if searching for uncertainty or reservation. Finding none, his expression softened. "You've given this considerable thought." "I have," she acknowledged, "not just for the valley's sake, but for yours. And for mine." She took a deep breath, gathering courage for what she needed to say next. "Nathaniel, these past days have shown me what kind of life I want, one with purpose, yes, but also with companionship. With partnership based on mutual respect and genuine affection." His breath caught audibly. "Abigail, let me finish," she said gently. "I know this is sudden. I know we've known each other only briefly in the grand scheme of things, but I believe some souls recognize each other even across scars and hardships. Mine recognizes yours." The vulnerability in her declaration hung between them as delicate and precious as morning dew on a spider's web. Nathaniel remained utterly still, his scarred face difficult to read in the dappled sunlight filtering through the pines. Then, with infinite care, he reached for her hand, his scarred fingers entwining with hers. "When Sophia died," he said, his voice low and measured, "I believed that part of me died as well, the part capable of loving, of being loved in return. I thought these scars, visible and invisible, made that impossible." He touched his damaged cheek briefly with his free hand. "I accepted that future, made peace with it even. But then," his eyes met hers deep and honest, "then you looked at me. Not at my scars, but at me. And something I thought long dead began to stir again." Abigail felt tears gather in her eyes, not of sadness, but of recognition of finding something precious, thought lost forever. "We've both been hiding," she whispered. "Me behind Oliver's shadow, you behind your scars. Perhaps it's time we both stepped into the light." Around them, the morning had fully bloomed sunlight dancing through pine boughs and glinting off the spring water. Birds called from the canopy, and somewhere in the distance a deer moved through underbrush, each sound part of the living tapestry of whispering pines. "I can't promise an easy path," Nathaniel said, his thumb tracing gentle patterns on her palm. "Harrison Mills remains a threat. The town will talk. And my scars, they'll always be visible, always draw stares and whispers." "Let them stare," Abigail replied with quiet certainty. "Let them whisper. I've spent too many years worrying about what others think. What matters is what we know to be true. And what truth is that? That healing is possible, that broken things can be mended, that life continues even after the worst fires have burned themselves out." She reached up her fingers lightly, tracing the edge of his scarred cheek. "That beauty exists in unexpected places, for those with eyes to see it." Nathaniel turned his face into her touch, his eyes closing briefly at the tenderness of the gesture. When he opened them again, they held a clarity and purpose that transformed his features. "Then, let us build that truth together," he said. "Day by day, not rushing headlong, but growing steadily like the herbs around this spring, drawing nourishment from sacred waters." "Yes," Abigail agreed, joy rising in her chest like birdsong. "Exactly like that." Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, the meeting of two souls who had known pain and were cautious with newfound happiness. But beneath that gentleness lay certainty, a foundation solid as the mountains surrounding whispering pines. When they parted, the world seemed somehow brighter, more vibrant with possibility. The spring bubbled on beside them, its waters catching sunlight and transforming it into countless diamond sparkles across the surface. "My mother was right," Abigail said softly, touching the silver pendant at her throat. this truly is a place of healing. For the body and the spirit, Nathaniel agreed. He rose, offering his hand to help her stand. Shall we return to the ranch? There's much to plan if we're to establish a clinic in the East Wing. Abigail accepted his assistance, but didn't immediately move toward the horses. Instead, she turned to look once more at the spring, the source of so much in her life, silver that would secure Whispering Pines' future, water that had sustained generations, wisdom that had guided her mother and now her. I think my father would approve, she said, not to Nathaniel specifically, but to the spirit of the place itself. Not of mining that destroys, but of healing that preserves. Of finding balance between old promises and new needs. A breeze moved through the pines, sending a shower of needles onto the water's surface. For a moment, Abigail could almost hear her mother's voice in the rustling branches, her father's laugh in the bubbling spring. Then Nathaniel's hand found hers again, warm and real, anchoring her in the present, even as she honored the past. "Ready?" he asked, the question encompassing far more than their immediate departure. Abigail smiled, certain of her answer. "Ready." Together, they walked back to their waiting horses, leaving the spring to its ancient rhythm, carrying its gift of healing with them, down the trail toward Whispering Pines, and whatever future they would build there side by side. The land that had shaped her would continue to do so, but now she would shape it in return, with wisdom gained through hardship with strength. Retry, DN, continue, edit with renewed purpose, with love that had been reborn at the spring's edge. As they rode side by side back to the ranch, the future spread before them like the valley below, vast, with possibility, rich with promise. The morning sun illuminated Whispering Pines in the distance, its white buildings gleaming against the dark pines that had given it its name. Ruth Sullivan stood on the porch as they approached, as if she had been expecting them. Her silver hair was braided and wrapped around her head like a crown, her dark eyes knowing as they took in the subtle change between her grandson and Abigail. "You found what you were seeking at the spring," she said as they dismounted. Not a question, but a statement of fact. "Yes," Abigail replied simply. "Clarity and courage." Ruth nodded satisfaction in her weathered features. "Good. Both were always within you, child. Sometimes we just need sacred places to remind us." Nathaniel helped his grandmother down the porch steps, his touch gentle but respectful of her independence. "We have an idea, Grandma, about the future of Whispering Pines." "A clinic," Ruth said, surprising them both. "In the East Wing, a place of healing for the valley." At their startled expressions, she laughed softly. "What? Did you think an old woman couldn't see what was coming? The signs have been there since you first brought Abigail to my cabin during the storm." Abigail exchanged an amused glance with Nathaniel. "And what do you think of our idea?" "I think it's time," Ruth replied, her voice carrying the weight of wisdom earned through decades of healing work. "Time for my grandson to use his gifts again. Time for this valley to have proper care. Time for old knowledge and new learning to work together instead of against each other." She touched the silver pendant at Abigail's throat with gentle fingers. "Elizabeth would approve. She always believed in bridges between worlds, between ways of knowing." The simple benediction meant more to Abigail than any formal blessing could have. Coming from Ruth, her mother's friend, a healer in her own right, a woman who had faced persecution with dignity, it carried special significance. "There will be challenges," Abigail acknowledged. "Harrison Mills won't surrender easily. The silver deposit complicates matters, and not everyone will approve of—" She hesitated, uncertain how to characterize the change in her relationship with Nathaniel. Of love finding its way through unexpected paths, Ruth finished for her, a knowing smile crinkling her eyes. Let them disapprove. The heart knows its own business better than any busybody in Silverwood. Nathaniel cleared his throat, a hint of color rising in his unscarred cheek. We're proceeding carefully, Grandma. This is still new. New, but not unfamiliar, Ruth countered. Like remembering something you've always known but temporarily forgotten. She patted his arm affectionately. Now, are we going to stand in this yard all day, or shall we go inside and begin planning this clinic of yours? The three of them moved into the ranch house, where Leonidas waited with coffee and Mrs. Finch's fresh biscuits. The foreman's expression revealed nothing when Abigail explained their plans for the East Wing, though a subtle nod suggested approval. We'll need to order medical supplies from Helena, Nathaniel said, already making notes on a sheet of paper. Basic equipment to start. Books from my old collection in Chicago, if they can be located. And renovations to create examination rooms, a dispensary, perhaps, a small surgery. And living quarters for you and Ruth, Abigail added. The rooms in the East Wing are spacious, but will need updating. Ruth watched their planning with quiet satisfaction, occasionally offering suggestions about herbs to cultivate and arrangements that would make patients feel at ease. The vision took shape organically, each contribution building on the others until a clear picture emerged of what Whispering Pines could become, not just a working ranch, but a center of healing for the entire valley. As the morning progressed, the conversation naturally turned to the silver deposit and its implications for their plans. Limited extraction could finance everything, Abigail observed. The clinic improvements to the ranch operations, even a trust for the Blackfoot people as we discussed. But done with respect for the spring itself, Nathaniel emphasized, ensuring its flow remains undisturbed, its sacred nature honored. There are ways, Ruth said thoughtfully. The old ones knew how to take from the earth without wounding it beyond healing. I could speak with the remaining elders who remember those ways. This synthesis of approaches modern medicine, traditional healing, responsible use of natural resources embodied everything Abigail had come to value. It honored her parents' legacy while creating something new, something that reflected her own journey from Oliver's diminished wife to the woman who now sat confidently planning the future of her inheritance. As they talked, the weight that had pressed on Abigail's shoulders since Oliver's death, since their marriage, really seemed to lift entirely. In its place grew certainty, purpose, and a quiet joy that suffused even practical discussions about building materials and medical textbooks. Later that afternoon, as Ruth rested in one of the guest rooms and Nathaniel conferred with Leonidas about potential renovations, Abigail found herself alone in her father's study. The familiar scents of leather and pipe tobacco embraced her as she settled into his chair, running her fingers over the worn desk where he had conducted ranch business for decades. I think you'd approve, Father, she said softly to the empty room. Not just of the clinic, but of the man. Nathaniel truly sees me as you always did. As someone capable and strong, not as an ornament or a possession. From the desk drawer, she removed the deed to Whispering Pines, the document that had represented both burden and blessing since her parents' deaths. Soon, with the banking commissioner's investigation underway and Mills's power waning, this paper would be truly hers again, free of Oliver's secret mortgages and Mill's manipulations. But it would be more than just hers. It would become part of a shared vision, a legacy renewed and expanded to serve more than just the Harrington family. Whispering Pines will live up to its name, she promised the memory of her father. a place of healing, whispers of wisdom carried on the wind. Outside the window, the afternoon sun gilded the eastern pasture, where cattle grazed peacefully. Beyond rose the north ridge, its pines standing sentinel over the spring that had changed everything. And beyond that stretched the future, uncertain in its details, but secure in its foundation. A gentle knock at the door announced Nathaniel's presence. He entered quietly, respect in every line of his bearing. "Leonidas thinks the renovations could be completed within 3 months," he reported. "Sooner if we hire additional workers from town." "That sounds perfect," Abigail replied, rising from the desk. "By harvest time, we could be ready to open the clinic." Nathaniel nodded, his gaze taking in the study, with its evidence of Thomas Harrington's presence books on ranching and land management maps of Whispering Pines, with careful notations in faded ink, the old rifle mounted above the fireplace. "It's a big change," he observed. "Are you certain this is what you want for your family's legacy?" Abigail crossed to where he stood, taking both his hands in hers, the unscarred left and the damaged right, holding them with equal care. "My family's legacy isn't in the buildings or even the land itself," she said. "It's in the values that built this place. Hard work, integrity, caring for others, adapting to change without losing what matters most." She squeezed his hands gently. "The clinic honors those values, as do you." Nathaniel's expression softened with wonder, as if still unable to fully believe the path that had opened before them. "Abigail Harrington," he said, her maiden name a declaration of her reclaimed identity. "You are the most remarkable woman I've ever known." "And you, Dr. Nathaniel Sullivan," she replied with a smile that held both teasing and deep affection, "are about to become the most valuable man in Silverwood Valley. How will you handle such importance?" "With humility," he answered seriously. "With awareness of my limitations, with gratitude for second chances." His scarred mouth curved in a gentle smile. "And with you beside me, if you'll stay there." "I'll stay," Abigail promised, "through whatever comes next." What came next would unfold in its own time. Harrison Mills' downfall as the banking investigation revealed the full extent of his misdeeds. The careful, limited extraction of silver from the North Ridge, supervised by experts who respected the sacred nature of the spring. The gradual transformation of Whispering Pines' East Wing into a clinic that blended Nathaniel's medical training with Ruth's traditional knowledge. And throughout it all, the steady growth of love between two wounded souls who had found in each other not just healing, but the courage to build something new from the ashes of the past. Standing in her father's study, as afternoon light streamed through the windows, Abigail felt the full circle of her journey from the girl who had loved this land, to the woman who had nearly lost herself in a loveless marriage, to the person she was becoming now. Stronger for having been broken, wiser for having suffered, more compassionate for having known pain. Like the silver-flecked waters of the North Ridge spring, she had emerged from darkness into light, carrying valuable elements that had always been present but required adversity to reveal. "Ready?" Nathaniel asked, offering his arm as they prepared to join Ruth for the evening meal, a simple question that encompassed all the complexity of their shared future. Abigail took his arm, her answer as certain as the land beneath their feet. "Ready." Yeah, and together they walked from the study into the gathering evening, two figures moving in harmony across the threshold of Whispering Pines Ranch, a place of promises kept, promises broken, and promises newly made under the vast Montana sky. And somewhere, perhaps, the spirits of Elizabeth and Thomas Harrington watched with approval as their daughter found her way home at last, bringing healing to the valley they had loved, just as the sacred spring had always promised she would. The end.